Welcome to Next Level Thinking Episode 7, Self-Defense Principle. In this episode, I explain why it's necessary to know how to defend yourself and others and to defend that right. For this episode, I'm trying something different. So instead of just having it not be super organized, this podcast, I am trying to become more organized and to have more to say on each episode instead of multiple short episodes. So what I think I'm going to try to do, or at least for this month's podcast, is to have, say, one podcast per month and have it be extensive, lasting for maybe like 2 hours, 3 hours, maybe 4 hours, and see how that goes. I'm a very in detail person. I like to get to find details, and I think it is important for understanding any topic that you do not just know the broad knowledge. I like to start with the broad knowledge for sure, but sometimes they say the devil's in the details, and details can be important. I don't go extremely into it though, like a book. I am trying to teach a broad understanding of topics and then go into the details that I feel that are important and necessary. Of course, with any topic, just about anything you could research, there's just an endless amount of information on any topic. So I only have so much time to be able to go into anything, but there's always more you can research about any topic that I go over in this podcast. And I encourage you to look for other podcasts and read other books and watch videos to learn as much as possible. There's no such thing as negative knowledge. You need to learn as much as you can about any topic, and don't be afraid to look into areas that may make you feel uncomfortable. I'm going to start with the quote for this episode. Sentient beings have the inherent right to use force to defend themselves from violence conducted upon them by another. What this means is that sentient beings are beings that are capable of rational thought and have emotions. So that would include human beings and potentially other beings as well that may exist in the universe that are human-like, have the ability to reason and have self-awareness and emotions. Basically, they have the right to use force, which is different from violence. Force is the right to defend yourself from violence, and you have that right ever since the day you were born. You've had that right. It is inherent to every person, no matter where they live or economic circumstances, race, religion, none of that matters. Every human being has this right. One of the pillars of enlightenment is self-defense. The right to defend yourself against violence or coercion or other innocence is inherent and is a birthright. This right exists as long as you are under coercion or you are being attacked. It can never be legitimately taken away, nor can any tool that you could use to defend yourself or other innocence, as long as you're a non-violent person, no matter how powerful that tool or weapon is. You also have the right to own and create weapons of any caliber or however powerful. You have the right to own weapons and create weapons of any caliber, from a simple shiv to a nuclear weapon, and weapons even more powerful. Rights don't change just because the weapon is too powerful. Imagine you're in a certain situation where you're being attacked by many people and you need a fully automatic 100-round magazine rifle to deal with threats, since reloading may lead you to being defensive. You may need bombs to deal with a criminal gang or large criminal gang operating base. These are rare situations, at least in the Western world and in America, but they do happen. It is your right to have the means necessary to stop the violence. You have the right to use force and defend yourself to the point where the attacker stops, or using equal force. If you are punched in the face, you do not have the right to kill that person, because that would be unequal force. But you do have the right to non-lethally punch them back. If they continue and do not stop, then you have the right to stop them. If they continue to be lethal, you have the right to kill them. When should you shoot someone? One of the most basic rules is the non-aggression principle, which says you shouldn't initiate violence against someone else. Now, if someone attacks you, you have the right to defend yourself. So if a civilian or another person is attacking you and using force against you, you have the right to use whatever lethal force to stop him if he keeps escalating. Level of violence he's willing to use to attack you to commit aggression, you have the right to keep escalating to the amount that they are using against you, even if it requires killing them. If someone attacks you, you have the right to defend yourself. This is a core part of the lesson, so I'll keep repeating this. Throughout this podcast, I will mention statistics, but it's important to know that gun stats do not change rights. Even if the stats show that guns are bad, rights don't change because of stats. It's nice when statistics help defend gun rights and rights of self-defense, but they do not depend on them. It may not always be the case that the stats support the right of the usage of guns or any weapons for defense. What if the statistics turned out that showing that gun ownership in the hands of non-violent people would do more harm than good? I mean, that doesn't make any sense, but what the statistics showed? I mean, a lot of these statistics are made up, or their methodology for the study is flawed. That's another thing you have to consider. When statistics are discussed in public policy decisions, they almost always are done at a cost-benefit analysis, which basically means politicians will think about what policy benefits more than it harms or has negatives. It involves taking a policy and weighing its positive and negatives. If there are more positive than negatives, then it is implied that adopting the policy is a good idea. If there are more negatives than positives, then it is implied that adopting the policy is a bad idea. That seems simple. That's called the utilitarian model, or the utilitarianism. Many think that all of our decisions about the policies that we should adopt for society should follow this model. The technical term, the virtue of utilitarianism is that it's a pretty easy, natural, and straightforward way of making decisions. While it does require sometimes require familiarity with relevant data and research methods, which means we have to frequently trust the so-called experts, it's all about the numbers ultimately. As intuitive might sound, there are many things that cannot be reduced to just a numbers game. And here's an example. Suppose that enslaving an innocent minority of the population to forced labor would yield more benefits than bad effects. Since the numbers check out, would that make involuntary slavery justifiable in this situation? No, it would not. The innocent minority's right to autonomy is more important than any gain in social utility. So just because something makes sense from another numbers perspective does not mean it is morally permissible. Here's another example. Suppose that the only way to save 5 dying people would be for a surgeon to kill an innocent person and distribute their organs among the 5. Assuming that the numbers would yield a positive result, would that be justifiable for the surgeon to do that? Again, absolutely not. A person's right to life resists the appeal of the so-called greater good. So just because something makes sense from another perspective does not mean it is morally permissible. You may say these scenarios dumb because they would never happen. Maybe they won't, but that misses the point entirely. What this example shows is that there are certain things that are more important than cost-benefit analysis. The extreme nature of these scenarios just serves to make them more evident. Rights are more important than utility. Rights are not dependent on what is beneficial for society. They cannot be overridden because there is a greater good at stake. Which, I mean, the concept of for the greater good of society is actually often a manipulation technique, and not in the policies that many politicians would say is for the greater good. It's actually not. They just use that as a way of advertising their policy to further their own agendas, which benefit them and are intended to control others. The question ultimately becomes is, why do you have the right to live? Is it because you can contribute to society? No. The right to life isn't dependent on your ability to perform at a certain level or to produce for society. You don't work to earn the right to life, nor it is based on merit. The natural right to live is simply because you are a person. Morality is about living well. It is impossible if the interest of the individual can be crushed by the majority. For that reason, rights exist as shields to protect us from mob rule, essentially. The right to life is the most fundamental right. It is the right that all other rights depend on. Rights to bodily autonomy, free speech, and others are meaningless if the person attached to those rights is dead. Your life isn't dependent on whether you are benefiting society. It is absolute and unrelenting, even if it be supposedly more beneficial to violate it. It would be wrong for a person to deliberately push an innocent man in front of his being trained if that man's death resulted in 10 lives being saved. So the right to life has a fundamental weight that cannot be overridden or defeated by any other right or social utility. But the same is also true for self-defense, the right of self-defense. The goal of self-defense is to protect life, and the right of self-defense must expand to all cases that the right to life extends to. Hence, the right of self-defense must have equivalent strength and scope to the right to life. Indeed, since the right of self-defense is just part of life, it must share it in its strength. There are other rights that are essentially the same as the right to life, and that is the right to self-defense. It is the right to defend yourself against a threat to oneself. You cannot use force to repel an attack without using some force, whether it be a stick, baseball bat, or just your arms and legs. Exercising self-defense requires that you do something, but in order to do something, you must first possess some means of doing so. So if I possess, for example, the right to self-defense, I must also possess the right to some other means of defense. The right to bear arms is essentially a natural extension of the right to life. The right to life, self-defense, and arms are all together and essentially the same. If you have one, you have all of them. If you lack one, you lack all of them. They all must possess equal strength and scope. So the connection to gun ownership should be possible. Guns are accessible, effective, and proportionate means of self-defense. The right to own a gun is therefore an extension of the right to live. The right to go own a gun is not itself a natural right, because guns are ultimately something that we invented. Its role in safeguarding our most fundamental natural right means that it shares in its strength and scope. Since the right to life is resistant to utilitarianism, so is the right to own a gun. The basis of gun ownership is that each individual has the right to have means of defending a deadly threat, whether it be a criminal or a government. Whatever effects guns have on average safety or crime stats, whether positive or negative, is secondary. Even if permissible gun ownership increased average crime, it will not weaken this right one bit. Again, I think the best statistical evidence shows that guns are in fact a force for good. Gun stats can help defend the right of self-defense as well and gun rights. And it's also more simple oftentimes to discuss to people stats than explaining the right of self-defense, although understanding the right to self-defense is actually more important than knowing the stats, and every human being should understand what their rights are, and if more people understood their rights, then they would understand not only more about themselves, but it would also be a great safeguard against tyranny as well. Gun rights cannot and never have depended on statistics. You can use statistics to strengthen your case for gun rights, but it cannot be the pillar on which it rests. The Second Amendment is a great statement of the right to self-defense. It actually does not say anything about gun ownership or gun rights, actually. It's a very simplified way of looking at the Second Amendment. Even though it is only 20 or so words long, it is actually has far more meaning than most people would think. But here's what the Second Amendment actually states. It says, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. In the 21st century, this might be stated as, since a well-regulated militia of the people was necessary to secure freedom, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The Second Amendment doesn't grant rights to anyone. It is merely a statement of rights that applies to all human beings, and it is eternal. It was written to try to prevent the government from infringing people's right to defend with arms. All laws written to limit what people can own and carry are immoral and therefore null and void. And several Supreme Court rulings have supported the Second Amendment as an individual right. And the Supreme Court is supposed to uphold the Constitution, also the Bill of Rights. The multiple revisions of the Second Amendment prove that the authors of the Constitution really said they wanted to add the right to bear arms for the common defense, but felt it would shift the focus on a collective right and not an individual right. So they rejected it. It was also echoed in other state constitutions at the time and even before the Constitution was written. Founding Fathers stated this clearly so you can understand what the Second Amendment actually means. The Constitution shall never be construed to prevent the people of the United States who are peaceful citizens from keeping their own arms. Samuel Adams said this at the Massachusetts Rallying Convention in 1788. The Constitution of most states and of the United States are stated that all powers are inherent in the people and they may exercise it by themselves, that it is their right and duty to be at all times armed. Thomas Jefferson, letter to John Cartwell, 1824. I ask, sir, what is the militia? It is the whole people. To disarm them is the best and most effectual way to enslave them. George Mason, Virginia's Convention to ratify the Constitution, 1788. No free man shall be debarred the use of arms. Thomas Jefferson, Virginia Constitution, Draft 1, 1776. A militia, when properly formed, are in fact the people themselves, and it includes all men capable of bearing arms. Richard Henry Lee, Virginia Delegate, Second Continental Congress. A well-regulated militia, composed of the people, trained to arms, is the best and most natural defense of a free country. James and Madison, a co-author of the Second Amendment. The word necessary is only used once in the Bill of Rights, and even the branches of government are not considered necessary. Why is it necessary? Well, here's why. A free state means free, not under the control or domination of others. And state is the particular condition that someone or something is in at a specific time. What it meant is a free state of existence, not a state such as Virginia, or a state as in a government or a nation such as the United States. It meant a state of existence. It was created for all people of the country, regardless of age, race, or any other biological factors, and cannot be infringed, even for military-grade weapons. In fact, citizens of the United States with no involvement in politics owned muskets and warships, which were the same weapons used by the military at the time. They were even fully automatic and semi-automatic high-capacity weapons, such as during the late 1780s, as well as such as the Ghirardelli air rifle, the buckle gun, the Belton flintlock, the pepper box revolver, etc. The founder knew these weapons, such as the Belton flintlock being proposed to Congress for the use in the Army, although it was denied. The Ghirardelli rifle was given to Lewis and Clark by Thomas Jefferson for the expedition. Age is not a factor in the right to bear arms. Remember, it says the whole people, and that includes all human beings. And it's fact it's necessary for children to know how to use firearms safely and protected to preserve liberty. And also, in case if they were to counter a firearm, then they would know, of course, not to mess around with it and to get someone who is trained in firearms to help them with it and to get it into a safe area. Because children who do not understand firearm safety can be victims of firearms and could potentially harm themselves or others accidentally. To preserve liberty is essential that the whole body of the people always possess arms and be taught alike, especially when young, how to use them. Richard Henry Lee, Virginia Delegate, Second Continental Congress. The word arms is short for armament, and it means the weapons and supply of war which a military unit is equipped or any instrument that is capable of being used as a weapon for the purpose of self-defense. It doesn't just apply to firearms, which is why firearms are not part of the Second Amendment. It applies to any weapon, essentially, that you can even think of. It was not created to allow government to keep and bear arms, since it's necessary for all governments to exist to have arms, and all governments by default give themselves this right, although it is not actual right for governments to exist. exists and it is immoral, as I have stated in other episodes. But that's a side topic. It was not referring to the right of National Guard militia, which is not a true militia. It's a state-based defense, basically, program. Patrick Henry says that Swiss was able to maintain independence due to their militia even without a standing army. And it's also worthy of note that Switzerland is one of the most peaceful nations in Europe and was not declared war on in either of the world wars, which almost every European country was a part of, whether they like to or not. So that should show you how effective militia can be at deterring hordes of armies. The well-regulated part of the Second Amendment comes from a 1698 treatise, a discourse of government with relation to militia, which well-regulated means well-behaved and disciplined, not government regulation. Regulation in those times did not mean government regulations, and the word regulation still is used today to mean to bring order, method, or uniformity to, according to Merriam-Webster. And according to dictionary.com, it means to adjust to a specific specification or requirement, regulate temperature, or to adjust a mechanism for accurate and proper functioning. In other words, the militia should make sure that they are disciplined, responsible with their weapons, and keep their weapons in good shape. And Mark Passio, someone who is a teacher of natural law and rights, stated how he would write the Second Amendment. Since it is true that a militia of the people, a decentralized distributed force of armed individuals comprised of the body of people who maintain working weaponry and tactics commensurate to a military force, is necessary for and essential to the preservation of a free way of life, the inherent natural rights of people everywhere to own and carry defensive weaponry of any kind shall never be encroached upon, so as to limit or undermine those rights. Excellent. Guns are often used actually to stop crimes and not to perpetrate crimes, way more often, and I will get more to that later. Laws that forbid the carrying of arms disarm only those who are neither inclined nor determined to commit crimes. Such laws make things worse for the assaulted and better for the assailants. They serve rather to encourage rather than prevent homicides. An unarmed man may be attacked with greater confidence than an armed one. This is from Cesare Beccari's essay on crimes and punishments. Criminals do not buy guns from gun stores most of the time. They buy and they get them from social networks or personal connection. Here's an example. In Pittsburgh, 80% of the criminals that were legally carrying guns were prohibited from possessing guns, and that those 30% of those guns were stolen. According to Gaps Continue and Firearm Surveillance, 60% of felons admitted that they avoided committing crimes because they knew the victim was armed, while 40% of felons admitted they avoid committing crimes because they thought the victims might be armed, according to Armed and Considered Dangerous, a survey of felons and their firearms. A survey of felons revealed the following. 74% of felons agreed. One reason burglars avoid houses where people are home is that they fear being shot during the crime. 57% of felons polled agreed. The criminals are more worried about meeting an armed victim than they are running into police. According to the Armed Criminal in America survey of incarcerated felons, Washington, D.C. basically banned guns since 1976, and it has a murder rate of 57 per 100,000. Across the river to Arlington, Virginia, gun ownership is far less strict, with the murder rate of only 1.6 per 100,000, according to the Crime of the United States, FBI, 1998. An insane difference. 57 versus 1.6 per 100,000, and it's just across the river. So you can't argue it's a cultural difference. It's massive. One of the, pretty much one of the places most likely to get murder at is Washington, D.C., despite the insane amount of police presence there. I mean, that just really shows you how useless the police will be in protecting your life. It is up to you to protect your life. Guns prevent an estimated 2.5 million crimes per year. Most often, the gun is never fired. In 83.5% of cases, which would be 2 million a year, of the successful gun offenses, the attacker either threatened or used force first, proving that guns are well suited for self-defense. Of the 2,500,000 times citizens use guns to defend themselves, 92% merely brandish their guns or fire warning shots to scare off the attackers. According to Targeting Guns, Dr. Gary Kleck, most criminals are more worried about meeting an armed victim than they are running into the police. According to Armed and Dangerous, survey of felon and their firearms. For every accidental death, 802, suicide, 16,869, or homicide, 11,348 with the firearm. 13 lives are preserved, or 390,000 a year are preserved through defensive use, according to unintentional firearms at 2001 from the CDC and the National Center of Energy Prevention and Control and Targeting Guns, Gary Kleck. The rate of defensive gun use, DGUI, is 6 times crimes that of criminal use according to crime statistics, the Bureau of Justice Statistics National Crime Victimization Survey, and Targeting Guns, Dr. Gary Kleck. And this was an average of 15 surveys where defensive gun use were reported. So according to multiple studies, essentially. 26% of all retail businesses report keeping a gun on the premise for crime control, according to Crime Against Small Business, U.S. Small Business Administration. In 1982, Kennesaw, Georgia passed a law requiring heads of household to keep one firearm on the house. The residential burglary rate dropped 89% the following year, according to crime control through the private use of armed forces, Dr. Gary Kleck. And I should note that even though statistics says this, I don't think there should be laws to force people to arm themselves. I think it has to be their willing choice. 90% of all violent crimes in the U.S. do not involve firearms of any type, according to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, or what is often called the ATF. Even in crimes where the offender possessed a gun during the commission of a crime, 83% did not use or threaten to use a gun, according to the National Crime Victimization Survey. Fewer than 1% of firearms will ever be used in the commission of a crime, according to the FBI Crime Statistics 1994. You are far more likely to survive a violent assault if you defend yourself with a gun, according to the value of civilian handgun possession as a deterrent to crime or a defense against crime, Don B. Cates. John Lott, the author of the book of More Guns, Less Crime and president of the Crime Prevention Research Center, writes, by 66% to 32%, economists and criminologists answer that gun-free zones are more likely to attract criminals than they are to deter them. A 60% to 40% margin thinks that guns in the home do not increase suicides, and a 62% to 35% spread so that guns are used in self-defense to stop crime more than the commission of crime. Even anti-gun Clinton researchers concede that guns are at least used 1.5 million times annually for self-defense. According to the Clinton Justice Department, there are as many as 1.5 million cases of self-defense each year with firearms. The National Institute of Justice published this figure in 1997 as part of Guns in America study, which was authored by an anti-gun criminologist named Philip Cook and Jens Ludwig. You might ask, if we can just confiscate the estimated 350 million guns in the country, then we could eliminate defensive use of firearms, so then we won't need them for any defensive uses. Well, good luck with that. Is there any reason that the war on guns would be as successful as the government's war on drugs? Anyone can tell you that it will be largely the innocent that will be disarmed. Criminals will have no problems keeping their guns and getting replacements through the black market. Whenever there's a crime or mass shooting or a crime with a firearm, there's always people out there that will say we need reasonable measures and reasonable restriction, or at least registration. It's the most basic logic in the world, and about 2 minutes to show why that is utterly stupid. People who promote this are either dense or lying. The voters are just probably being dense, and the politicians pushing in are liars and crooks. Here's why. What does gun registration means? It means that the people in power have a list of people and the guns they've registered. So you haven't got the serial number and you can look it up and say, oh, Bob owns that particular rifle, whatever it is. That's all gun registration does. It gives them a list of owners and firearms they have registered. Of course, it doesn't give them a list of firearms that are purchased illegally, not registered. It only gives them the registered firearm. Okay, so let's say we have that. Oh, good. Now we're all safe. It's for the children, etc. Well, what good did that do? Okay, so we have gun registration. Let's consider a scenario. A guy takes a gun, goes into a liquor store, and he holds up the place, and he steals some money. They even shoots the owner and runs away. But luckily, he did that with the registered firearm. Guess what it does? It doesn't do any good. Because when the investigators get there, there's a dead guy with some bullets in him. They don't know what gun was used. Sometimes in a traffic accident, people will say, oh, I got the license plate of the car driving away. Nobody in any shooting has ever said that. And no one in a shooting has ever just left their gun at the scene of the crime. They always take it with them. Which means in this scenario, gun registration is absolutely useless in investigation. And people who watch too many movies would think that you can look at a bullet and analyze it and tell what gun it came from. But you have to actually have the gun and shoot another bullet to see if the grooves of the barrel match the bullet. You have to have the gun. If the guy comes in and commits a crime and then runs away with the gun, it does not help. And here's another scenario. Scenario 2, a mass shooting. People say we need gun registration to stop mass shooting. How would that help when someone is going to go out on a shooting rampage for whatever reason in the head that they think it's a good idea? They're not intending to get away with it. They don't think, oh, nobody's going to notice I run into school and shoot 30 people. They know they're going to get noticed. They know they're going to get caught most of the time of them plans dying. They'll either kill themselves or do suicide by cop and die. So that happens. Well, you say, well, luckily the gun was registered, so we can go and find the dead guy who just had a shootout and now he's dead. And the gun lies next to him. We can look up the gun and see that he was the one who did it with that gun, but what good does that do? He's already dead. And it's not a deterrent factor because he knew he wasn't going to get away with it and he was going to die or rot in jail. So it doesn't do any good. There are tons of voters out there that say we need reasonable registration, and that's just a complete Orwellian doublespeak. There's nothing reason about registration. Even if you had every firearm registered, the politicians aren't dumb enough to think it's going to reduce crime, which means they're just liars and crooks and only care about control. So why do they want it so bad? They know and easily understand this basic logic, which is that it's not going to help or to investigate or prevent crimes. They want it because it is good for taking away guns. That's why they ever want it. They want gun registration so they know where the guns are, so when they take them, it'll be much easier to do. This will only increase crime, gun registration, and other gun control measures. Knowing who committed the crime with a certain firearm does not do any good. And it's simply too late to do anything about it once the crime has already happened. And as people say, well, we need at least a database. Well, that's not going to do any good really either. It's just a way to get people to be afraid and to give up their liberties and their firearms so that they're defenseless, so that politicians grab more power and restrict liberty. And they say, we'll have to do something for the children. When politicians say that they have to do something, they mean that they want to get more power, and what they say and what they do is what they need, not what you need. They look after themselves, aka number one. Countries with the strictest gun control also tend to have the highest homicide rates, according to violence, guns, and drugs across country analysis. Major surveys compared the last 20 years and more provide no evidence of any relationship between the total number of legally held firearms in a society and the rate of armed crime, nor is there a relationship between the severity of controls imposed in various countries or the mass bureaucracy involved with many control systems with the apparent ease of access to firearm by criminals and terrorists, according to Minutes of Evidence, Colin Greenwood. There's no correlation to firearm ownership and firearm homicide, according to Firearm Ownership Small Gun Survey 2007 Crime, United States Office of Drugs and Crime. In Canada, around 1920, before there was any form of gun control, the homicide rate was 7% of the U.S. rate. By 1986, after the significant gun control legislation, Canada's homicide rate was 35% of the U.S. rate, a significant increase. In 2003, Canada had a violent crime rate more than double that of the U.S. 963 versus 475 per 100,000. According to Targeting Guns, Gary Kleck, the crime rate is 66% higher in 4 Canadian prairie provinces than in the northern U.S. states across the border, according to a comparison of violent and firearm crimes in the Canadian prairie provinces and 4 U.S. border states. Many countries with the strictest gun control has the highest rate of violent crimes. Australia and England, which have essentially banned gun ownership, have the highest rates of robbery, sexual assault, and assault with force in the top 17 industrial countries, according to crime victimization in 17 industrialized countries. Dutch Ministry of Justice. Crime in Australia has been rising since a sweeping gun ban on private ownership. In the first 2 years of this ban, the government statistics show that a dramatic increase in criminal activity, and homicides are up 20%. From the inception of firearm confiscation to March 27, 2000, the numbers are: firearm-related murders were up 19%, armed robberies were up 69%, home invasions were up 21%. The sad part is that in the 15 years before the national gun confiscation, firearm-related homicides dropped nearly 66%, and firearm-related deaths fell 50%. According to Crime and Justice, crimes recorded by police, Australian Bureau of Statistics, Australian Institute of Criminology. According to the United Nations Office on Drug and Crimes study, when you compare overall intentional homicide rates, regardless of the weapon used, with the rest of the world, the United States finished roughly around middle of the pack, ranking 94th out of the 219 countries included in the study. Note this is despite the fact that America has the highest gun ownership, providing there is no strong correlation between homicide and gun ownership. And the thing is, if people want background checks, they can do it through the private sector. There's plenty of alternatives that stores can use. In fact, some stores do have their own system of background checks, and there isn't many gun stores that would sell to someone who is a known criminal because they do not want to encourage that behavior. With the current background check system, you have a occurrence of false positives, which means an individual who goes through the background check, their name is mixed and matched with another criminal with a similar first and last name or contact information. They're effectively disarmed or unable to own a gun and have to go through a process of appeals. As this database gets bigger and bigger, the margin of error becomes wider, and you can see possibly hundreds of thousands of people restricted their guns right just because of bureaucratic errors. And like I said, rights don't depend on, politicians or AI algorithms or any of that. They're inherent and can never be infringed upon. And that just what happens when you let the government get involved in affairs, which should be handled by the market or civil society. If you examine all the multiple victim shootings in the United States from 1977 to 1999, it shows that the average states that adopt the right to carry laws experience a 60% drop in rates at which the attacks occur and a 78% drop in the rates at which people are killed or injured from such attacks. FBI Uniform Crime Units 1992. A total violent crime rate is 26 higher in the more restrictive states that have more restrictive gun control, 698.3 per 100,000 population. Then in the less restrictive states, it is 631.6 per 100,000 people. The homicide rate is 49% higher in the restrictive states. And in the states with less restrictive concealed carry weapons license laws, 6.8 per 100,000. The robbery rate is 58% higher in the restrictive states, 289.7 per 100,000, than in the less restrictive states where it is 183.1 per 100,000. The aggravated assault rate is 15% higher in the restrictive states, 455.9 per 100,000, than in the less restrictive states where it is 398 per 100,000. A 1993 national survey of 4,977 households found that over the previous 5 years, at least 0.5% of households had members who also used a gun for defense during a situation when they thought someone almost certainly would have been killed if they had not used a gun for protection. This is amounted to 162,000 incidents per year. This excludes military service, police work, or work as a security guard. This is from the paper Arms Resistant to Crime: The Prevalence and Nature of Self-Defense with a Gun by Gary Klecht and Mark Gert. Based on a survey from the U.S. Department of Justice, roughly 4.9 million violent crimes were committed in the U.S. during 2014. These include simple, aggravated assaults, robberies, sexual assaults, rapes, and murders. Of these, about 600,000 or 10% were committed by offenders visible with a gun. Based on survey data from 2000 study published in the Journal of Quantitative Criminology, the U.S. civilians use guns to defend themselves and others from crime at least 989,883 times per year. A 1994 study conducted by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention found that Americans use guns to frighten away intruders who are breaking into the house about 498,000 times per year. A total of 888 people have died in mass shootings since 1982. That's a total of 1% of all gun deaths, approximately 2/3 of which are suicide. Politicians and celebrities will often talk about supporting gun control legislation immediately after mass shootings, or at least the appearance of a mass shooting. An example is in the Las Vegas shooting in 2017. Hillary Clinton said on Twitter, "Our grief is not enough. We can and must put politics aside, stand up to the NRA, and work together to try to stop this from happening again." Notice how she said we must put politics aside, and then she immediately says we must stand up to the NRA. This is obviously a contradiction. Others include Senator Dianne Feinstein, late night host Jimmy Kimmel, Ariana Grande, Caleb Ketter, and even a top legal executive at CBS, Haley Geffman Gold, said she was not sympathetic to those who died because country music fans are often Republican gun donors. Because you disagree with someone politically, that means you should just not care that they died. Instead of trying to pursue justice for the victims of Las Vegas shooting or question the inconsistencies of the official narrative, influential politicians, celebrities, and media figures have instead resorted to calling for gun control, and it's just disheartening and it's blatantly irresponsible. America is not high on the list of deaths from mass shootings. It is ranked 11 out of deaths rate per million people from mass shootings from 2009 through 2015. It is 11th out of 18 industrialized countries, which include countries such as Norway, Russia, Netherlands, and Austria. This is according to crimeresearch.org, and they use the number of murder with 4 people with firearms as the definition of a mass shooting. The issue is that mass shooting is not a legally defined term, so different studies use different definitions for finding what counts as a mass shooting. In some studies, if a bullet is fired and accidentally hurts no one, it's a mass shooting. There's more reasonable definitions such as the murder of 4 people with firearms, but the point is that almost every study varies. This inflates the numbers of mass shootings greatly. It is unfortunately doubtful that any society can entirely prevent murder. It is possible, though, to reduce the number of victims, and the best way to do this is by encouraging people within the community to take responsibility for defense rather than relying on incompetent government agencies such as the police. And powerful weapons with big magazines can help accomplish this, or any weapons that can be used for the purposes of self-defense. It is correct that the probabilities of mass shootings are greater than the probabilities of tyranny simply because the number of people who engage in mass shootings is almost anyone. But the number of people who engage in tyranny is very small. The authorities, the people who control the military and the police, these are the individuals who could impose tyranny on a system. Making laws to order guns out of criminals' hands does not work because criminals do not obey laws, which actually is by definition what makes them a criminal, at least according to the legal system. All this does is disarm so-called law-abiding citizens, which makes them vulnerable to criminals. If carrying around a gun for your self-defense is necessary, and it is, since essentially police have no obligation to protect you, according to Warring v. District of Columbia in a Supreme Court case ruled, and it takes an average of 5 minutes, then I would honestly say just carry it around legally because your defense is more important than what other people feel about what they think their right to be safe is, to do whatever you want, as long as you not hurt others, is more important than anything else. In the Waring v. District of Columbia Supreme Court case of 1856, ruled that you cannot sue a local law enforcement agency for not responding to an emergency call. And as recently as the Clinton administration, the Supreme Court upheld that ruling. So if you're in an emergency situation, you call 911, the police don't show up, you have no right to be able to sue the police, providing you are responsible for your own protection. You can never enough of a budget really to have enough security guards to provide security at every school in the country. Eventually, we'll run out of the budget. Sometimes security guards and police at schools even cower at the mass shooters. So you will need to have as many people possible that are trained and armed and responsible. So at least one person will have the courage to defend the rest, since usually all it takes is one person to defend, and then others will assist in their defense. The thing is, children have often been encouraged to attend the schools, and the administrators in charge of these schools have not provided adequate security. They're essentially endangering the children by a combination of coercion to attend and the absence of adequate security. They have been negligent in a civil sense, and perhaps even criminally negligent, given how we know shootings always occur in gun-free zones. Dr. Park Dietz, forensic psychologist, said on how to stop mass shootings, "I repeatedly told CNN and other media following, if you don't want to propagate more mass murders, don't start the story with sirens blaring. Do not have photos of the killers. Do not make it 24/7 coverage. Do everything you can to make the body count lead story. Localize the story to the effective acute community and make it as boring as possible in every other market." And this is transition to another section. I'm setting up this podcast differently, and I'm having sections. And this section is the gun doesn't pull the trigger. Culture, crime, and mental health is the problem. There's a well-established phenomenon of copycat suicides known as the Werther effect. In other countries, medias have taken a step to minimize the Werther effect through having their media industries have a different standard for reporting suicides and mass shootings, and they often parallel each other. This is to prevent more suicides and mass shootings happening by people wanting to copy others who do shootings and suicides. The American media has no industry standard practices for how to cover either suicides or mass shootings. However, one can easily see the difference between how mass shootings and suicides are covered. A suicide is treated as a somber tragedy, but mass shootings have sensationalism turned up to 11. There's a detailed discussion of the shooter's life story, motives, and methods. Strong evidence suggests that this both encourages and instructs potential mass shooters. Researchers at the Arizona State University analyzed news reports of gun-related incidents from 1997 to 2013. They hypothesized that the rampages did not occur randomly over time, but instead were clustered in patterns. The investigators applied a mathematical model and found that shootings that resulted in at least 4 deaths launched a period of contagion marked by a heightened likelihood of more bloodshed, lasting an average of 13 days. Roughly 20 to 30% of all violence took place in these windows. Despite the low frequency of these tragedies, the media pays an insane amount of attention to them for self-serving reasons, because there are both political and economic reasons. This demonstrated the anti-gun agenda of American media, and there's an ongoing shift in the media's business model to attention-based revenue that results in ever more sensational news coverage and clickbait headlines. The media does this for 2 reasons. First of all, it makes them good money. Newspaper and other media are businesses and do whatever generates the most profit. However, there's another more sinister and cynical reason that must be put forward. The American media has a political agenda that includes the wholesale banning and confiscation of private firearms. The mainstream media no longer relies on subscribers for most of the revenue. Instead, they get their money from page clicks on the internet, which are then pitched to advertisers as a symbol of their overall strength as an advertising venue. This means that the business model of the average newspaper or magazine has shifted from long-term subscription to getting as many clicks as possible. Studies have shown that people are far more likely to click on sensationalized news stories and clickbait than anything else. What this means for the mainstream media is that it has a high incentive to publish the most outrageous, sensational, and insane versions of events when reporting the news. Put simply, whatever gets the most attention then spreads the furthest and generates the greatest amount of income for the company in question, be it Facebook or the New York Times. Mass shootings generate big business for the media, so they help to fuel the attention directed towards them. Refusing to share articles about the mass shooters can be one way that consumers begin reversing this trend. It's worth noting, like terrorism, the intended effect of mass shooting is attention and fear. When the society reacts hysterically to mass shootings without proportion, it is playing into the hands of the agenda of the mass media as well as the intended shooter. What's perhaps most interesting is that in the NIH study, it found that it didn't matter if the portrayal of a mass shooter was even factual or realistic to be an influence on the mass shooter. Even merely describing the behavior of a shooter had the effects of influencing later shooters. The report specifically called out of the media's portrayal of mass shooters, however. They cite the reporting ad nauseum of the personal life details of the shooter, his crimes, and even the manifesto, an important part of any mass shooting, that have an imitative effect on future mass shooters. Consider the portrayal of mass shootings in the media. The very act of being the session of the news and social media is a sort of social status attractive to the type of person flirting with the idea of being a mass shooter. The life story of a mass shooter can provide a point of resonance and relatability, as similar criminals tend to fit a similar profile. The portrayal of shooter wielding guns or even looking menacing in a photograph projects a aura of danger and toughness that can be attractive to those who are hanging on the edge. Manifestos can inspire for action, especially if one of the goals of the manifesto is to create terror or panic. Well, then mission accomplished. Detailed reports of what happened can provide a sort of instruction manual for future shooters. All of this combined provides a very powerful and attractive cocktail inciting further mass shooting. Note that the suggestion is not to ban the reporting of mass shootings. This would be a mistake. People have the right to be informed of significant events, and mass shootings are no exception. However, the manner in which mass shootings are reported is the problem. The emphasis on the personal narrative of the shooter, the views that motivate him to commit the crime, and the glory detail of his dubious success are the issue. There are other alternatives with regards of betraying the mass shooters in the media beyond tactics like withholding the names on the face. For example, mass shooters are often treated as dangerous, powerful men. This makes mass shooting attractive to certain unstable psychological profiles. On the other hand, shooting could be just as easily portrayed as the shameful act of a cowardly individual. Coverage could likely emphasize punishment in cases where the shooter is apprehended alive. The shooter's rationale could be downplayed in coverage. Description could be very surface. For example, Islamic jihad or white nationalism. Eschewing discussion of the personal and biological information about the shooter likewise have a similar effect. The NIH points out that repeatedly reporting gears of bullying as the motive portrays rampage killing as the only response to being bullied. Finally, there's the question of duration and frequency on which mass shooters are reported. When a mass shooting occurs, the coverage tends to be wall and wall for days. This certainly belies an agenda on the part of the media. Now people call for gun control. The cause of this and other mass shooting is not guns, but is a sick society. Most of the perpetrators legally obtain their guns. Laws against murder, illegal use of firearms, legal discharge of firearms, assault with deadly weapons, and in California, transporting a firearm across state lines that is legal. All these laws, and no doubt many others are violated. None of these statutes prevent these crimes, something nobody seems to be willing to discuss. No society where violence is glorified. Go to a movie or you watch events and the violence is fine. I think video games might also have to contribute to it, the violence in our culture, although perhaps not as much as some would say, but it is a possible factor. In a lot of these games, you get points for how many people you kill. I mean, that could have an influence on certain people who are unstable. I don't think the majority of people would, obviously play violent video games and then become violent, but there are some who it would make them more prone to commit violence. Denying this is putting your head in the sand. The same Hollywood that advocates gun confiscation are the same Hollywood that glorifies guns and killings in their movies. The main thing, however, is to make the coverage as general and non-specific as possible. This is the best way to reduce the overall excitement and prestige enjoyed by the shooter and his actions. Every seemingly innocuous terms like lone wolf can glamorize a shooter. The FBI Director James Comey believes that media predictions of mass shooters contribute to the problem in the United States. After the Atlanta shooting, he said, "You will notice that I am not using the killer's name, and I will try not to do that. Part of what motivates 6 people to do this is this kind of thing and some twisted notion of fame or glory, and I don't want to be part of this for the sake of the victims and their families. And so other twisted minds don't think this is a path to fame and recognition." The FBI has specifically requested that the media stop naming mass shooters, but most refuse to. A study conducted by Mother Jones located no fewer than 74 copycat killings, attempting or executed, of the 1999 Columbine shooting alone. The casualties total of these individuals include 89 deaths and 126 injuries and 9 suicide. A national paranoia will rationalize increasing police activity, security, state activities, national security activities, the military-industrial complex, and all of that benefits from the environment that's created by mass shootings. There are some common attributes to mass shootings. The Irish author James Augustine Joyce once wrote, "In the particular is contained the universal. Mining the gold of this particular can be helpful when seeking to understand a seemingly incomprehensible event. In Dayton, Ohio incident, an examination of 24 contrabands revealed a psychological profile startlingly similar to that of other shooters. He's a single male. He's a troubled teen. He once drew up a hit list of students he wanted to kill or maim. He experienced serial rejection from the opposite sex." The paper Part 1 Mental Illness, Firearms, and Violence by James Malcolm and Amy Swearer makes clear that that while most mentally ill individuals are not and never will become violent, certain serious mental illnesses, especially when untreated, are associated with the higher prevalence of certain types of firearm-related violence. In particular, individuals with serious mental illness are at a greater risk of committing suicide and are responsible for a disproportionate number of mass public killings. There is, however, a strong connection between acts of mass violence, including mass public shootings, and untreated serious mental illness. The majority of all mass public killings, some studies estimate as many as 2/3, likely suffered from serious mental illness prior to their attacks, and often displays clear signs of delusional thinking, paranoia, or irrational feelings of oppression associated with conditions such as schizophrenia and bipolar-related psychosis. The most significant link between mental illness and firearm-related violence is suicide, which accounts for almost 2/3 of all annual firearm-related deaths in the United States. The most common method of suicide in the U.S. is through the use of firearm, an unsurprising reality given that the U.S. has a high per capita number of privately owned firearms in the world. Despite the nation's exceptionally high rate of suicide by firearm, however, it does not have a particularly high overall suicide rate compared with other countries. At the same time, the number of countries with severely restricted gun control laws have much higher rates of suicide than the United States, including Belgium, Finland, France, Japan, and South Korea. Moreover, the percentage of suicides committed with firearms has actually decreased since 1999, even though the number of privately owned firearms has increased by more than 100 million. As this data suggests, broad restrictions on firearms access are unlikely to have an immediate effect on general suicide rates, and there are other socioeconomic factors beyond firearm availability that better account for differences in suicide rates. These factors largely include measures of social cohesion such as divorce rates, employment, poverty, past trauma, and family structure, and it's increasingly clear that more socially integrated communities also tend to have lower suicide rates. The reduction of suicide rates requires a comprehensive approach that addresses all the various factors related to suicide risk, including mental illness, socioeconomic variation, access to a support system. The broad-scale disarmament of the general population is an inappropriate and unnecessary substitute for dealing with the underlying problems. Analysis conducted by the Central Florida Intelligence Exchange, CFIX, has found that 79% of mass shootings since 2011 have been perpetrated by individuals with demonstrated signs of continuous behavioral health and mental illness. In a July case study titled Acts of Violence Attributed by Behavioral Mental Health Issues, CFIX analyzed 14 mass shooting incidents that occurred between 2011 and 2013 and only found only 3 of the shooters had no history of mental illness. Nearly every mass shooting and incident in the last 20 years and multiple other instances of suicide and isolated shootings all share one thing in common, and it isn't the weapon used. The overwhelming evidence points to the single largest common factor in all these incidents is the fact that all the perpetrators were either actively taking powerful psychotropic drugs or had been at some point in their immediate past before they committed their crimes. The drugs most correlated to mass shootings in the last 2 decades are commonly known as antidepressant, mood saboteurs, and antipsychotics. Individuals more commonly consume antidepressants than any others. I will discuss them more. However, these apply to other prescribed drugs as well. Numerous neuroscientists and physicians state that the chemical imbalance theory is false, such as Ronald Pies, Jeffrey Lacasse, Jonathan Leo, and Jonna Moncrief. These drugs do not really help with depression in the long term. Actually, depression is often listed as a side effect of these drugs. Psychiatrists often lie to their patients, telling them that they have chemical imbalance. Since many patients suffer from severe depression, blame themselves, and the psychiatrists want to shift the blame to make the patient feel better. Psychiatric disorders are not real disorders or disease, according to Alan France, one of the most well-known psychiatrists in America. There are often social constructs to explain common mindsets, emotions, and behaviors. According to Peter Briggins, a former psychiatrist professor at Harvard, it is a mistake to view depressed feelings or even severely depressed feelings as a disease. Similarly, formerly renowned Cambridge biological psychiatrist Robert Bernardzin remarks, psychiatry has lost its ways and has become a distributed center for psychiatric drugs. It needs to face that psychiatric problems and symptoms are human problems, no more, no less. Derived from the formation of our characters, we adapt to our emotional environment. Real psychotherapy addresses what ails us, not psychiatric drugs. In other words, you need to get to the root of the problem. Here is an analogy. Instead of just putting simple bandages when you're putting hand on the stove, it would be better to take your hand off the stove. Psychopharmacologist Richard de Grandpere, in association with the Duke University, says that there is no invented medicine that treat any psychiatric disorders. In fact, they're often just synthetic versions of dangerous drugs with no benefits, such as cocaine and meth. In the journal The Journal of the American Medical Association acknowledges that Ritalin acts much like cocaine. It was developed in the 1950s to mimic the results of cocaine. Adderall is a synthetic version of meth. Drug manufacturers simply change the name of the legal drugs and make them legal by making slight differences, and then they can be sold to the public and trusted by consumers. Psychiatrist Bezel Van Der Kolk states, over the past 3 decades, psychiatric medications have become mainstay in our culture with dubious consequence. Consider the case of antidepressants. If they were indeed as effective as we have been led to believe, depression should now be a minor issue in our society. Instead, even as antidepressant use continues to increase, it has not decreased depression. The number of people treated for depression has tripled over the past 2 decades, and 1 in 10 Americans now take antidepressants. Editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine, Marcia Angel, says, in The Truth About Drug Companies, How They Deceive Us and What to Do About It, that big pharma exists mostly on fraud, false advertisement, misleading information, and refusal to fully disclose facts. SSRIs also block normal re-up intake of serotonin and cause suppression of normal emotions of the mind. Physicians refer to this as emotional blunting, medical spell buying, psychic numbing, psychiatric indifference, and neurological suppression and intoxication agnostic. Professor of psychiatrist at the University College London, Joanna Moncrief, explains, according to the drug-centered model, rather than reversing some underlying brain enormity, psychiatric drugs themselves create abnormal altered states of physical and mental functioning. Psychiatrist Peter Briggen says that these drugs can incite violence, including murder. He then says, except for clozapine, all antipsychotic drugs cause a functional lobotomy by blockading dopamine neurotransmission, which is the main conduit to the frontal lobes. This blockage is what causes chemical lobotomy with the sought-after effects of indifference, apathy, and docility. Dr. Briggen says that Prozac can cause violence, suicide, and crime. These drugs cause people to lack empathy and see people as animals, and animals as the same as non-living objects such as pencils. These psychotic drugs also cause akathisia, a feeling of restlessness and panic, which is associated with violence and suicide. SSRIs provide failing hope for those who consume, because after 6 months consuming them, research shows that most people lose hope in their effectiveness. The former head of placebo studies at Harvard University, Irving Kursik, explained that sugar pills offered to people in clinical trials are powerful antidepressants, have similar effects to SSRIs, and in many studies they have better results, which further suggests that antidepressants may actually make depression worse. His conclusion after years of careful research is that hope may be offered in the attempt treatment of hopelessness. Whereas hopelessness is the central feature of depression, hope lies in the core of the placebo effect. Placebos instill hope in patients by promising them relief of their distresses. Genuine medical treatments also instill hope, and this placebo component of their effectiveness. When the promise of release instills hope, it encounters a fundamental attribute of depression. Indeed, it is difficult to imagine any treatment successfully treating depression without reducing the sense of hopelessness that depressed people feel. Controversy, any treatment that reduces hopelessness may also assuage depression. So a convincing placebo ought to relieve depression. A former researcher at Stanford University Medical Center, Bruce Lipton, says in the Biology of Belief, which is an excellent book, another interesting fact about the effectiveness of antidepressants is that they have performed better in clinical trials of the year, suggesting that their placebo effects are in part due to the savvy marketing. The more the miracle of antidepressants was touted in the media and advertisement, the more effective they became. Beliefs are contagious. We now live in a culture where people believe that antidepressants work, so they do. Such a reality explains why mass shootings, bombings, and violent acts continue to increase and will occur again and again, more and more as more psychoactive drug consumers are made each day. Drugs are not necessary for the spiritual heart to be violent and act out of horrific nature, but they are known chemical enablers of violence and suicide. In a study of 31 drugs that are disproportionately linked to reports of violence towards others, 5 of the top 10 are antidepressants. They are Prozac, Paxil, Lovox, Effexor, and Prozac. 2 other drugs are for treating ADHD. They're also in the top 10, which means that they're given to children who could then become violent. One could conclude from the study alone that antidepressants cause both suicidal thoughts and violent behavior. This is a prescription for mass shootings. Sylvan Duke writes, if you develop digestive problems after a change in diet, do you look for the cause in foods that you ate or the new ones you started eating? While the answer is obvious, the common sense is painfully uncommon when analyzing the new phenomena of continual mass shootings. Many blame the long-present foods, gun in this case, and ignore the new diet which coincided with the problem. And part of what's new is the widespread use of psychiatric drugs. Politicians get more votes for proposing gun control than they do legal drugs by using fear-mongering. The Guardian reports, pharmaceutical companies spend more than any other industry to influence politicians. One study shows a quarter of all children on drugs such as Paxil and Zoloft become dangerously violent or suicidal. 27 drug regulatory agencies cite psychiatric drugs side effects of mania, psychosis, violence, and homicidal ideation. 1,531 cases of psychiatric drug induces homicide/homicidal ideation have been reported to the U.S. FDA. 65 high-profile cases of mass shootings/murder have been committed by individuals under the influence of these drugs. Yet there's never been under a federal investigation into the link between seemingly senseless act of violence and the use of mind-altering psychotropic drugs. Dr. Kelly Brogan says, "We know that all drugs have side effects. That is just part of the deal, right? But is it possible that antidepressant can cause the same person to act like a cold-blooded criminal?" The answer is yes, and worse. They cause people to become mass murderers going on killing sprees, and they are destroying the fabric of society in America, and the press does not have the integrity to report on it. The damage done by Ritalin is similar to frontal lobe syndrome. Over time, this can make the person increasingly capable of inhibiting impulsive behavior and depression. There have been 65 high-profile cases of senseless fighting, including mass school shootings, mass stabbings, and even the intentional crashing of a commercial airplane committed by individuals taking or withdrawing from psychiatric drugs since October 9, 2017, according to CCHR International. A mentally ill person is anyone whom a psychiatrist or other health care provider says is mentally ill. There is no science behind a mentally ill person. There's no blood test that you can take. There's no brain scan that you can do. There's no x-ray that you can do to determine whether or not someone is mentally ill or not. It's an opinion, and innocent people have the potential to go to jail with the testimony from a psychiatrist. Let's say, for interest, the subjective label ADHD, the Association of Psychiatry sat at a table and raised their hands and voted for the story into the Bible that they used to blow out the United States government. Big Pharma is a product. People get tricked into taking psychiatric drugs because life is difficult, and sometimes everyone struggles. Everyone has some anxiety, some guilt, some shame, some anger, and some difficulty, and that's just taken advantage of by psychiatrists who claim that they can essentially cure life's problem by drugging people. Many of these things that they drug are fundamentally spiritual problems. Is my life worth it? Is there a reason to live? Should I stay married? Is it wrong to get divorced? Do I have the courage to get a better job? May other result from childhood abuse, trauma, deprivation. None of these things really fall under the authority of physicians who don't know anything about them. The American Psychiatric Association, the American Medical Association are trade unions to enforce the power and wealth of physicians. They are not public service institutions. If you ask the average psychiatrist if he/she feels mass shootings are caused by psychiatric drugs, they will most likely say no, they did not do the killing because they were mentally ill. Other psychiatrists maintain that the mentally ill tend to be peaceful, if not docile. It's only when activated by psychiatric drugs they become aggressive or violent, or be withdrawing from psychiatric drugs. There is a great deal of evidence that psychiatric patients are no more violence prone than anyone else. Weapons are inherent objects, and they do not have the power to kill. It is only the people who hold the weapons that could cause the weapon to be used for some purpose. It's the people who are using the weapon that we need to focus on. The statistics are now there that by far the majority of these mass shootings were committed by people who are on psychotropic drugs. If 1 in 6 on psychiatric drugs in the U.S. population is 327 million, that means 17% of the population, or 55 million people, are on psychiatric drugs. That being said, even a small percentage of these 55 million have adverse effects, this translates into potentially thousands of shooters, terrorists, and violent criminals. Of course, if you get a million people on psychiatric drugs, only a small percentage of those have extreme reactions, that adds up to a very large number. Mass shootings and other atrocities have been escalating since the 1980s when certain kind of antidepressant came on the market. The SSRI drugs do not cure chemical imbalance. They cause a severe chemical imbalance in the animal that they tested on, and they do the same thing in human beings. All this can cause akathisia and mania. Akathisia is terrible irritability and inner anguish, which can lead to violence. And mania is an euphoric, out of control mood that's extremely irritable and touching and can lead to violence. Then it becomes an unpredictable, random reaction in the brain as the brain fights back against the drugs, producing an extremely unstable state. Prior to the 1980s, mass shootings caused an average of 17 deaths per decade. After the 1980s, mass shootings caused an average of 92 deaths per decade. This is a 540% increase in the time period right after SSRIs, the antidepressants like Prozac, Lovux, and Paxil became widespread. Although correlation is not causation, there is a serious correlation between mass shootings and SSRI antidepressants. One must also consider the effects of direct-to-consumer advertising. When in 1997, the FDA made it easy for Big Pharma to advertise psychiatric drugs to the masses on network TV. Drug companies are spending most of their time advertising money on TV. It is almost impossible to watch TV for any length of time without seeing direct consumer advertising to psychiatrics. It's one of the most ugly chapters of scientific history in our known era, what we call Big Pharma, the pneumatical industry is totally corrupt. Every single large premises is accomplished as a massive court record of having deliberately falsified testing results to favor the acceptance of these drugs. These falsified results, they've hidden evidence of adverse reactions. And so they put these drugs on the market and they make billions of dollars in profits. It's a business model. They know eventually someone's going to sue them. They're going to have to go to court, and yet they're going to lose the lawsuit. They're going to have to pay out $1 million in claims to compensate some family for the loss of a loved one or for the permanent disability. But it's nothing compared to the profits they have made. Another possible correlation is violent video games. Those weaker than mental illness, or at least severe mental illness that would cause violence, and psychiatric drugs. The American Psychological Association, APA, considers violent video games a risk for aggression. In 2017, the APA Task Force on Violent Media concluded that violent video game exposure was linked to increased aggressive behaviors, thoughts, emotions, as well as decreased empathy. However, it's not clear whether violent video game exposure was linked to criminality. Studies have shown that playing violent video games can increase aggressive thoughts, behaviors, and feelings in both short-term and long-term. They could desensitize people to violent behavior and decrease empathy. Some studies suggest competition of players in violent video games is a better, or a video games in general, is a better predictor of aggressive behavior. Note that many competitive video games are violent, however. An international study looking at more than 17,000 adolescents aged 9 to 19 from 2010 to 2017 found playing violent video games led to increased aggression over time. The analysis of 24 studies from different countries found those who play violent video games such as Grand Theft Auto and Call of Duty were more likely to exhibit behavior such as being sent to the principal officer, fighting, or hitting a non-family member. In the study by the National Academy of Sciences, those who played violent video games, whether infrequently or frequently, had an increased risk of aggressive behavior. The new research echoes Hull's previous finding that violent video games equate to about twice the risk of being sent to the principal's office or fighting during an 8-month period, he said. The effect is relatively small, but statistically reliable. The effect does exist, Hull said. A lot of people ask, do these games really cause these kids to behave aggressively? I would say that this is one possibility, he said. The other possibility is that it's a really bad sign. If your kids are playing these games, either these games are having a warping effect on right or wrong, or have the warped sense of right and wrong, and that's why they turn to these games. Either way, you should be concerned about it. Mass shootings and other terrorist acts are often done by either fake or staged by governments in order to increase gun control or the power of police and surveillance. And this is the next section, and this is also a huge problem that a lot of people I don't think truly understand, or the implications of faking these attacks or staging them, and how politicians and others benefit from this. And going back to the video games, though, I used to actually play a bunch of violent video games such as Call of Duty and Grand Theft Auto, and I was probably one of the least violent people you could ever meet, and never really raised my voice. So it just depends on who is how is affected. I'm naturally a pretty peaceful person, so maybe that's why it didn't have a great effect on me, but on certain individuals it can increase aggression, and for most it will actually increase aggression just a little bit, but it's not the most definite research. Anyways, the strategy is called Hegelian dialectic, or problem reaction solution. You have a problem or present the illusion of one, hype up the problem to be worse than it is on media, and then present the solution. This process is calculated and drawn up before it is executed. The media exaggerates the issue of gun crimes and mass shootings in order to support gun control in a more powerful police state. Gun control is proposed almost immediately after false flags such as Port Arthur in Australia or the Christchurch shooting in New Zealand. The government knows that the crimes drop significantly when people have access to guns, therefore the government wants to revoke the rights, so they must depend on them for safety, although government is the antithesis of safety. At Sandy Hook, for example, a Rest in Peace Facebook page was created for Victoria Santo, a teacher at Sandy Hook, and it was posted on December the 10th, 4 days before the massacre. On December 11th, Google indexed the United Way website that offers condolences to the family of Sandy Hook, 3 days before the massacre. 2 weeks before, the Attorney General Eric Holder met with Governor Daniel Malloy to launch a new project called Project Longevity to support gun control under the guise of reducing gun violence. And at the Aurora Theater shooting, a gunman was dressed in tactical clothes, had tear gas bomb making gear, booby-trapped devices, bulletproof vests, ballistic helmets, a SWAT uniform, and other odd items. Shortly before the shooting, there was a trailer for Gangster SWAT showing gangsters shooting at the crowd. Sandy Hook and Aurora were both present in the Dark Knight Rises movie. The movie that was playing in the background during the shooting. Shortly after the Sandy Hook event, Facebook purged many accounts that carried pro-Second Amendment and pro-liberty information. Hearing voices often what mass shooters say they experienced during shooting. Using military technology called voice-to-skull tech by using long-range acoustic devices, nobody else can hear these messages, and they can be put into the mind of a person with the devices at remote locations. The shooter, Aaron Alexis, at the Washington, D.C. Naval Yard filed a report on Rhode Island about his harassment that he believed was from microwave-directed energy weapons. He also reports that 3 people were sent to follow him and send attacks to his mind. A woman, Miriam Carey, reported hearing voices of Obama talking to her before she slammed her car through a White House barrier. The Boston Marathon bomber claimed that he was under majestic mind control before the attack. The Fort Lauderdale mass shooting of Esteban Santiago weeks earlier walked into an FBI field office, claimed that he was hearing voices and that the CIA was controlling his mind. After the shooting, he claimed that he was forced to have terrorist thoughts and that the government was controlling his mind, forced him to watch ISIS videos. Jason Dalton, who killed 6 people in Kalamazoo, Michigan, says he was being controlled by the Uber app during his massacre. When he would open the app, a symbol would appear and he said it would take over your whole body. A lawyer named Myra May shot 3 people as claimed to hear voices and was electronically asking gang stalked by the government. He sent info, which was intercepted by the FBI, to try and prove this before the shooting. A week before the shooting, he posted on Facebook, "Also, has anyone encouraged by your handler to kill with the promise of freedom?" Jared Laffner killed 6 people and wounded Congressman Gabriel Giffords. He claimed that he was framed and handpicked illegally to be a sleeper assassin, and that the government put a chip in his head to control his mind. The assassin of John Lennon also claimed to hear voices. Note that John Lennon was an outspoken critic of the Vietnam War. According to a document, a CIA Project Blue Book artichoke states in the 1960s they were creating mind control slaves using hypnosis to commit murder. According to Brown University, it's also possible to implant false memories and false perceptions into people. Another possible reason for these mass shootings using DECNEF. Fatherlessness might also be an issue as well for mass shooters. As University of Virginia professor Brad Wilcox pointed out in 2013, from shooting at MIT to the University of Central Florida to the Ronald E. McNair Discovering Learning Academy in Decatur, GA. Nearly every shooter over the last year in Wikipedia's list of U.S. school attacks involved a young man whose parents divorced or never married in the first place. His observation is largely ignored. There's a direct correlation between fatherless and teen violence. According to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, fatherless children are at dramatic increased risk for drug and alcohol abuse, which could lead to violence. According to a 2015 study, even if all the guns were removed from America in a 10-year period, 355 people would still have been murdered in mass killings. 4 more people murdered, according to the study, is what is considered a mass killing. From 2006 to 2015, 140 people were murdered by arsonists in mass fires. 104 were stabbed in mass shootings or stabbings, and 92 people were beaten to death in mass killings, according to James Allen Fox of the Northeastern University. If natural law-abiding people do not do something post-haste, you are very likely to wake up morning around 4 a.m. with the sound of a SWAT team breaking down your door to confiscate your guns, prepared to kill you or any member of the family who resists. Why? Because perhaps a gun-hating neighbor hates you for having guns, or a relative doesn't like you and is looking for a way to teach you a lesson, or your ex-spouse is looking for any way to get even with you, or an anti-gun cop with a grudge wants to send a political message, or a family doctor or school teacher overheard one of your children talk about how many guns daddy has and has become alarmed, etc. Plus, the FBI has just recently stated that if you believe in conspiracy theories, you are a domestic terrorist threat. That statement is from the FBI Intelligence Bulletin from the Phoenix Field Office, dated May 30, 2019. The FBI destination alone could very easily precipitate a red flag gun confiscation order to be rendered against you. As a practical matter, if the government interest is in separating a potentially dangerous person from guns, it makes no sense to leave other guns that belong to the family member in the house. So if you live with someone that gets a red flag order issued against him, then you and other people living in the same home risk losing your guns too. Connecticut enabled the first red flag law in 1999, followed by Indiana in 2005. This means social sciences had decades to analyze the effects of these laws. And what did they find? The evidence, the New York Times recently reported, for whether extreme risk protection orders, which is also known as red flag laws, work to prevent gun violence is inconclusive, according to the study by the Rand Corporation on the effectiveness of gun safety measures. The Constitution mandates that no one shall be deprived of life, liberty, and property without due process of law. Seizing the property of individuals who have been convicted of no violent crimes violates this provision. Gun control advocates claim due process is not violated because people whose firearms are taken can appeal to the courts to reclaim their property. However, an economist, Raheem Williams, has observed this backwards process would imply that the Second Amendment is a privilege, not a right. Depriving individuals of a clearly established right in the absence of criminal charge or trial is an affront to civil liberties. In theory, red flag laws are supposed to target individuals who pose a threat to themselves or others. In practice, they can work quite differently. In a 14-page analysis, the American Civil Liberties Unit of Rhode Island explained that few people understand just how expansive the state's red flag law is. It is worth emphasizing that while a seemingly urgent need for the law deprives of recent egregious and deadly mass shootings, the law goes far beyond any efforts to address such extraordinary incidents, author said. Individuals who find themselves involved in these proceedings often have no clear constitutional right to counsel. As written, a person can be subject to an extreme risk protection order, REPO, without ever having committed or have threatened to commit an act of violence with firearms. Though comprehensive information is thin and laws differ from state to state, anecdotal evidence suggests that Rhode Island's law is not unique. A University of Central Florida student, for example, was hauled in proceeding and received a year-long RPO, risk protection order, for saying stupid things on Reddit following a mass shooting, even though the student had no criminal history and didn't own a firearm. The student was also falsely portrayed as a ticking time bomb, according to police. Jacob Solom reports. Other recent reports was slapped with an RPO for criticizing teenage gun control activists online and sharing a picture of an AR-15 he had built. Individuals who find themselves involved in these proceedings often have no clear constitutional right to counsel. Red flag laws are essentially a form of pre-crime. If it sounds far-fetched, consider that the president recently called upon social media companies to collaborate with the Department of Justice to catch red flags laws using algorithmic technology. The idea that government can prevent crimes before they occur may sound like sci-fi fantasy, which it is in the movie Minority Report, but the threat such ideas pose to civil liberties is quite real. Compromising civil liberties and property rights to prevent acts of violence that have yet to occur are policies more suited for dystopian thrills and police states than a free society. It is clear that laws of this magnitude should not be passed as an emotional or political response to an event, even a tragic one. In this next section, I'm going to be going over the nonsense of gun control and debunking some gun control what people believe to be facts. The very act of attempting to limit our natural right to defend ourselves with weaponry is, in of itself, tyranny. Mark Passio. All infringements on your right to defend yourself are invalid. Infringement means to limit or to undermine, to encroach upon. Encroach means to advance upon gradually, beyond usual acceptable limits. The way gun control is pushed is using incrementalism, an ideology of Fabian socialism, and their original logo was of a wolf in sheep's clothing, and the organization that is behind gun control in many countries, and especially in Britain. Gun controllers take your right to defend you so slowly that you do not notice it, and at some point it is too late. And then you're living in tyranny. It is often background checks, then registration, then confiscation, then tyranny, and then ultimately genocide. The best way to take control of a people and to control them utterly is to take away a little freedom at a time, to erode rights by 1,000 tiny, almost imperceptible reductions. In this way, the people will not see those rights and freedoms being removed until it passes the point which those changes cannot be reversed. Pat Miller. We've all heard the idea that if you put a frog in cold water and gradually heat the pot, the frog will stay in the water and never jump out of it, allow himself to be boiled to death. Whereas if you drop the frog into a pan of really hot water, he'll jump out immediately. And I think it's true that when you relate this to human nature, people do get used to incremental increases of tyranny. They get used to greater and greater inconveniences and insults from government until finally they just accept the whole total package. Yes, the gun controllers know exactly what they're doing, and the mainstream media, being part of the gun controllers' arsenal, never allows guests on show to discuss the real purpose of the Second Amendment. Their long-term mission is to slowly boil the frog and disarm we the people so that, without noticing, we fall into the hands. Gun control advocates believe guns should only be in the hands of military and police. Rights, however, are the same for everyone. So how does law enforcement, which is just a standing army, have the right to own and use firearms that the people don't? Belief that the military or police can have and use firearms but the people cannot is a recipe for tyranny, slavery, and mass murder. Yeah, many people will say police are violent, racist, murdering thugs, but only the police should have guns. This is a classic example of cognitive dissonance, having two opposing ideas at the same time accepting both is true. The need to feel safe or even children being murdered by firearms is not a reason to abolish rights, nor is there ever a good reason. If a child dies due to gun violence, the person responsible for the violence is the criminal, not the innocents who happen to own guns. It is the equivalent of punishing all kids in the class because one kid talked out when they weren't supposed to. This is called collective punishment. Most child fatalities by firearms are due to lack of proper weapons training and training by adults, which would be omnipresent if we maintained a well-regulated militia. It is a universal normative truth that individuals are responsible for their own actions. This can be found in Aristotle, who stressed the capacity of each individual to choose, and Kant, who placed reason outside the casual chains of the material words, but also in Buddha, who said, "We alone are responsible for our own lives." This is true now, in millennia from now, and in Sri Lanka equally as in Montana. Universality is the real condition of equality. Only cultures that rejects this truth, as currently academically fueled culture does, could claim access to the weapon is the cause of people choosing to use weapons to kill people. Any effective argument against Second Amendment infringements or any other violation of individuals' freedoms must be made at this level. More than that, such a culture encourages people to think along its line, to act willfully and violently, but without responsibility. After all, the responsibility is a cultural belief that is only true to the extent that one agrees with the culture culture. The fear of weapons is hoplophobia. Hoplophobia, like homophobia, is a displacement symptom. Hoplophobes fear their own forbidden feelings and urges to commit violence. This would be harmless except that they project these feelings onto others. Fear almost always stems from ignorance. Since they don't know how to use weapons to protect themselves, they irrationally fear that all weapons are going to harm them somehow. When it comes to weapons, they act only with fear, and they insist that everyone else should have to lose their rights of self-defense so they can be allowed to not be afraid. This is an immature mentality of a fearful and bratty child with poor and absent parenting. Government is only too happy to step in and become a fake proxy parent for such our own children, mentally immature adults. People who don't want the responsibility to self-defense because they fear they may be injured or killed in excess of that personal responsibility. They're also highly fearful of the possibility that they may need to shoot and kill another human being in their own self-defense. If someone was attempting to take your life or freedom of those you love, would you be willing to kill another human being if necessary? You have to be a spiritually broken person to think you cannot kill another person who is calling for your life. I speak more of this on Guns and Crime. 2007 CDC studies shows that only 0.6% of accidental death are from guns, while the highest in motor accidents, which are 68 times more likely. Less than 1% of accidental gun deaths are from homicides, according to Stray Bullets and Mushrooms, Sherman Steele, Lofweiser, Hoffer, and Julian, Journal of Quantitative Criminology, 1989. Nationwide, 500,000 self-defense uses. Every year, as many as 500,000 citizens defend themselves with firearms away from home. Concealed carry laws are dropping crime rates across the country. A comprehensive national study determined in 1996 that violent crime fell after states made it legal to carry concealed firearms. The results of the study shows states which passed concealed carry laws reduced the murder rate by 8.5%, rapes by 5%, aggravated assault by 7%, and robbery by 3%. If those states did not have concealed carry laws had adopted such as in 1992, then approximately 1,507 murders, 4,177 rapes, and 60,000 aggravated assaults and over 11,000 robberies would have been avoided yearly. Dr. Gary Kleck interviews with John Nell Schumann. In the interview, Dr. Kleck reports finding on the national survey which he and Dr. Mark Gertz conducted in spring 1993. Gun control does not work. Chinese police destroyed 113 illegal gun factories and shops in a 3-month crackdown in 2006. Police seized 2,545 tons of explosives, 4.1 million detonators, and 117,000 guns, according to Chinese Radio International Online, September 7, 2006. When a gun control bill is being debated or people believe gun control is about to increase, sales will go up, meaning more weapons will be in the hands of people instead of less, showing gun control does not really work. FBI figures show another jump in purchases and background checks with the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, showing that in 2016 there was the highest number of sales when sales soared in anticipation of Hillary Clinton winning the election because she was openly supporting strict gun control. 2019 is likely to be the highest year after mass shooting since the talk of gun control. Once upon a time, shooting clubs and bringing guns into school was common. In 1975, New York State had over 80 school districts with rifle teams. In 1984, they had dropped to 65. By 1999, there was just 26. The state's annual rifle championship was shut down in 1986 for lack of demand. This sadly is a familiar story across the countries. The clubs are fading from memory too. This is largely thanks to the zero tolerance policy. Until 1989, there were only a few school shootings that resulted in death, with an average of 2 killed. This is despite widespread gun ownership and no gun-free zones. No, many mass shootings do not involve injury or death. Gun-free zones at the federal level began with the Gun-Free Schools Act of 1994. After that, school shootings that resulted in death and injury increased and had a higher average rate of deaths, though there may be other factors involved besides gun-free zones in schools. There is a strong correlation. Many magazines and catalogs from the 40s and 60s to advertise guns to children. Hundreds of thousands of students would bring rifles to school, put them in lockers on bus in class, and school shootings are rare. If we had gun control, we would not have less crime. To think you can have 30 plus million guns be legislated out of existence is absurd, if not impossible. Imagine a pack of hyenas stalking a person. As they go to kill that person, they repel them with the rifle. They retreat and think, if only we could separate the gun from that person. One of the easiest ways to control people is to make them defenseless. Proof of this is in the communist and fascist regimes of the 20th century that estimated to have killed 250 million people, and it's possibly far greater. The reason it was so easy to do this is because people were already disarmed after passing legislation to disarm them, and it was difficult for those killed to resist them. Rapists and muggers want people to be disarmed so they can terrorize and get what they want from victims with virtually no consequence. Politicians and organized crime want people to depend on them for protection, which is just extortion in reality, of course. Being unarmed by choice or by compulsion guarantees having to exist at the mercy of others who are more armed than you. Violent criminals are direct beneficiaries of gun control. When natural law-abiding people are disarmed, they can rob, rape, murder without worrying that an intended victim would retire them from the business of crime. Isn't it strange that many who favor gun control don't mind having powerful rifles protect families of the federal government and bank guards? Apparently, protection of important people and their money is proper in their eyes, yet some of the people who don't want a parent to protect their children, they are hypocrites. A number of states that have actually liberalized gun laws to a large extent by accepting permitless constitutional carry, where any law-abiding citizen can carry a firearm without a permit. Even with these laws in the books, crime rates have continued to drop, incidents of gun accidents have dropped. Gun control supporters want a criminal organization called government that has killed hundreds of millions of people throughout history to have all the guns. If you have a medical marijuana card, apparently, if the 9th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeal says that you cannot buy a gun, which is just more evidence of more bogus gun control laws for insane reasons. I mean, you can do alcohol and you can drink alcohol and still buy a gun, even though that have more negative effects. Now, I'm not saying that if you do buy alcohol and drink alcohol, that you should not be allowed to have a gun. You should be allowed to have a gun if you do any sort of drugs or alcohol, as long as it does not make you commit violent acts. The court ruled 3-0 that a ban preventing medical marijuana card holders from purchasing firearms is not a violation of the Second Amendment. There are 9 Western states under the appeals court's jurisdiction, including Nevada, where the case originated. The court maintained that drug use raises the risk of irrational, unpredictable behavior with which guns should not be associated with. Alex Critt, marijuana law expert at the San Diego's Thomas Jefferson School of Law, expects that this ruling won't last long, won't be the last we see of this issue. He told the AP that the ruling may be challenged by people who use medical marijuana who will argue that they shouldn't be lumped with other drug uses in terms of concerns about violence. Marijuana does not cause you to become violent. There is no evidence of that. Those who say that clearly have no research or understanding of marijuana. Some say that the Second Amendment is the ultimate guard against tyranny, but they do not want to get any more specific. More specifically, if the people have the ability to kill government agents, it limits what the government can do to them. If you're supporting banning any sorts of guns, fully and semi-automatic rifles, pistols, shotguns, rifles, etc., it means you're going to tell several million Americans who already have guns, and there are several million who do, that they're either going to hand it over to the government who has lots and lots of these, they're either going to surrender their guns, or lots of government agents with guns are going to take their guns, and take them away and put them in a cage. Do you see how absurd this sounds? If you support government agents going to someone's house to violently take their guns and cage them, arrest and incarcerate them, if you do not, they don't give up their guns. Think of what you're actually saying about you. You know, if you're imagining that you're non-violent, you're peaceful, and you're anti-gun, and then you're advocating that millions of people who haven't hurt anyone and threatened anyone be threatened with violence by men with guns if they own a gun. What you're actually saying is ultimately, a practical of what you're saying is, you would rather have all those people killed, since that will happen if you resist being arrested by government, than let them keep their firearms, even if they had perfectly reasonable, which, well, the vast majority of them are responsible, and never threaten anyone ever. People say that we want gun control to stop violence. Well, gun controls require violence. It is inherently violent to take guns away from people, especially people who don't want their guns taken away from them. This notion that gun control is peaceful and that they stand on higher moral ground is bogus. In a lot of ways, gun control is a Trojan horse. When people talk about the so-called common sense gun control, what they mean is they want to create an environment where more gun control can be brought in. It's a ruse to ultimately lead to gun confiscation, where only those who are in law enforcement, military, politicians, politically can use guns, or at least will be prohibitively expensive to buy them. Also, several things to think about that have changed a lot, even with a lot of solid grassroots activists have not been aware of. You're seeing corporate gun control as well. For example, banks are now starting to break ties with pro-gun organizations. A lot of corporations are starting to break ties as well with their pro-gun affiliates. For example, Walmart stopped selling, I believe, ammo after the El Paso shooting at a Walmart in El Paso, or any type of gun organization or whatever whatsoever. Politicians proposed the buyback program disguised as voluntary transaction. However, if you don't choose to sell them your guns, unlike a business, they will force the transaction. Also, the buyback program makes it sound like the government originally owned your guns, but they never owned your guns. You always were the ones to own them, not the government. Buying back makes it sound like they sold you the guns. Governments did not sell the guns to you, though. They have no ownership of the guns and is your property. According to the Department of Justice, the average federal conviction for weapons violations resulted in 87 months in prison, compared to 82 for drug offenses, 28 months for property crimes. Polls, which are often highly manipulated to serve an agendas, show most favor gun control, but that does not make it okay. People tend to set aside their rights when they feel they're unsafe. For crime or a foreign invader, rights are inherent and can never be legitimately taken away. The gun control lobby that seeks to disarm Americans, really, if you look into them, almost all of them have some direct or indirect financial or political ties to the government itself. And since we know that that governments, especially powerful tyrannical governments, want citizens to be armed, they're all for gun control. It is not difficult to understand why the people who are either in government or depend upon government or close to government call for gun control. They do not wish people to be armed to resist the tyrannical government because they know that a part of that tyrannical government can benefit from its existence and continuance. This next section is about red flag laws. 17 states have some form of these laws, but only a couple of them have mental health. None of us wants mentally imbalanced people or terrorists to have guns. But these laws are a slippery slope in some way for the government to get between a citizen and the right to keep and bear arms. The gun grabbers is salivating over this. They want government determining who is eligible to exercise their Second Amendment rights. Left wants some type of process like in the movie The Minority Report, where the government reads the minds of citizens and takes action to arrest citizens before they commit some crimes. Although it is also noticeable that many people on the right, or the so-called right, wish to support this agenda as well. Of course, reading the minds is a bit of a hyperbole, but those laws would have prevented government people across the country determining that someone who tweeted, made a Facebook post, and wrote an email is a danger to society, that if they raid that person's home and take their weapons. This then becomes a Fourth Amendment violation. So we start with the government deciding what someone said is unacceptable, violating the First Amendment. Then the government violates the Fourth Amendment, deprives the citizen of their Second Amendment right. A man, Ralph Gilbertstein, in Richfield, Minnesota, had no criminal record, yet police came and stole 3 of his guns. Officers took his guns because he believed in UFOs, Bigfoots, and conspiracy theories. The police lieutenant Mike Flattery in Richfield said, "I'm confident our officers seized weapons with the best intentions. It was mental health issues, and I think the cops responded appropriately. The process is being followed. If the court rules that we have to return these weapons, then we will return them." Police took his gun at the request of Hennepin Community Outreach for Psychiatric Emergencies after Ralph Gilbertstein sent a message saying he believed CIA agents were watching him. Gilbertstein's psychiatrist, however, said the man poses no threat. The use of suspicion of mental illness as a pretext for gun confiscation is on the rise. An example is the new California law that allowed judges to order confiscation of weapons without giving gun owners a chance of appeal. What's as little as a misunderstood Facebook post, your gun rights could be stripped away and your life turned upside down. In other words, a judge could issue the order without ever hearing from the person in question. And if there is reasonable grounds to believe that person is a threat based on the accounts from the family and police, a Firearms Policy Coalition press release states. Red flag laws propose that people can have their rights and property taken away from them on the basis of mere allegations. No reasonable suspicion is needed, let alone proper cause or custody or sufficient education, all to enable a policy has been proven to be ineffective. 1,700 citizens had their gun confiscated in 2018, but the number is likely far higher, as some states didn't report these gun confiscation orders. As those who may be in favor of such laws consider the following: there's no way to stop an estranged spouse from calling the police repeatedly and telling that their ex is threatening to cause harm to others. Anyone at any time now has the ability to claim that someone else is a threat and have the police take their guns. It should also be noted that taking away someone's guns and gun rights doesn't prevent them from obtaining guns legally, either by stealing, getting from friends, or through the black market. Red flag laws are becoming increasingly popular, where the police can seize your guns with no due process merely because of an accusation of someone saying that you're a threat or mentally ill. For those who might be aware, red flag laws are allegedly devised to disarm individuals who may be high risk to commit violent acts before they would do so. They are technically called extreme risk protective orders. These red flag laws can be thrown up by law enforcement, mental and medical professionals regarding a person's mental state or capacity to harm. In some cases, family members and others can also trigger the gun confiscation order. The violation of the Second Amendment is most obvious, since forcibly disarming an American citizen through a matter of law which has committed no crime is a clear infringement of the Second Amendment. In fact, so is the popular idea that mentally ill people should not have no access to weapons. The fact is that mentally ill people still have rights in this country, or anywhere. The truth is that no one wants a severely mental person walking around with guns. Mentally ill people still have rights, though. If they've not committed a crime, they still have the same rights as everyone else. The Fourth Amendment is violated because American citizens are essentially tried, convicted, and disarmed without due process. The first is violated because the alleged crime, or red flag, is not an actual crime, but speech and expression, which in many cases the merely feeling of a threat by a person throwing up a red flag, both of which are protected by the First Amendment. And as for involuntary confinement, the U.S. has already allows for mental health persons to involuntarily confine people with slightest statements violating their rights, more often than not ruining their lives with forced medication. The fact that medical and mental professionals have as much authority as they do should be abhorrent in a free society. And thus we arrive at the second frightening aspect of red flag laws, the further weaponization of mental health and psychiatry. This is precisely the method used by Soviet Union when critics of the government were deemed mentally ill and forced into treatment where they remained or where they re-educated or medicated into conformity. One of the tricks that is used in the old Soviet Union was whenever there was a dissenter, they said the person was crazy, and they would take them into a mental institution and inject drugs into their veins and drive them totally insane to prove their point. And then they'd be locked up, put in a straitjacket, and tortured, etc. There was a systematic political view of psychiatry in the Soviet Union based on interpretations of political opposition or dissent. As a psychiatric problem, it called psychopathological mechanisms of dissent. During Soviet leadership, psychiatry was used to disable and remove from society political opponents, aka dissidents, who openly expressed beliefs that contradicted the official dogma. The term philosophical intoxication is what it was given to, for instance, and was widely applied to medical disorders diagnosed when people disagreed with the country's communist leaders. In other words, if you disagree with the Soviet Union Stalin, they diagnosed you with philosophical intoxication, which basically meant you disagree with communism, or they would label you with sluggish schizophrenia. Sluggish schizophrenia was the most infamous diagnosis by Soviet psychiatry due to its usage against political dissidents. After being discharged from a hospital, people diagnosed with sluggish schizophrenia are deprived of the civil rights, credibility, and their employability. The use of this diagnosis has been internationally condemned. Sluggish schizophrenia is what basically means that you don't have schizophrenia, but then you eventually develop because you don't believe in the political norms of Stalin. Psychiatrics has been used as a weapon in other countries as well. It has been used against the Falun Gong in China. Faluninfo.net says psychiatric torture of Falun Gong practitioners is widespread. Falun Gong people were put into hospitals and they were abused mentally. They were given drugs and hallucinogenics, all to get them not believe in their religion. And psychiatry was used as a tool against them. They were put into re-education camps to retrain them how to not be brainwashed. This has been used as a weapon. China has been doing this to the Uyghur Muslims. China believes Islam is a mental illness that needs to be cured. China is treating Islam like a mental illness. The country is putting Muslims into internment camps and causing real psychological damage in the process. It wasn't just Muslims that were getting educated and put into the camp. China is also doing the same with Falun Gong religion, Christians. They say they're not capable of societal things. They say, let's condemn Christians, Muslim, Falun Gongs with the mental illness. But abuse of psychiatry and law enforcement meld is no means unique to the Soviet Union. Mechanisms are already in place in the United States and have been for some time. Indeed, every day in the United States, countless people are forcibly hospitalized for having committed no crime whatsoever. The sad truth is that this is eerily similar to the events what happened in the mid-1900s with the Soviet Union, where political dissidents were labeled psychiatric duds and diagnosed with sluggish schizophrenia for opposing those in the government. In fact, psychiatric was used as a weapon to eliminate political opponents who openly expressed their belief against the tyrannical regime running the country. As a result, they were put into psychiatric incarceration for writing certain books, participating in civil rights movements, or adopting religion that the government didn't like, and ultimately views having a form of mental illness that needed to be cured. Couldn't we be looking at something similar here in the U.S. with political dissidents they believe they don't like, such as the most recent target, libertarians, patriots, and outspoken veterans? From its inception as colonies, the United States has included the political abuse of those who are seen as psychologically deep. Between early 1692 and 1693, at least 20 people died because they were accused of violating the orthodox belief of authorities. They were called witches, which may be close to a psychiatric diagnosis as that period office, such as in the Salem witch trials, although there were many other witch trials as well. The most totalitarian institution America has never known was slavery. Only the current prison system compares. During this period, the abuse of psychiatry reveals a second purpose. It not only provides social control, but also justifies savageries in the eyes of those who commit it. Consider the psychiatric term drapetomania. It refers to mental illness defined in 1851 by a doctor named Samuel A. Cartwright in order to explain why slaves ran away. He stated that fleeing slavery is as much a disease of the mind as any other species of mental alienation, and much more curable as the general rule. The recommended cure was whipping the devil out of slaves as a preventive measure against those who displayed signs of this impending mental illness. In his 2010 book, The Protest Psychosis, How Schizophrenia Became a Black Disease, psychiatrist Jonathan Metzl explored the 1960 history of the Iowa State Hospital for the Criminally Insane in Michigan, which is now a state prison. The hospital was notorious for treating blacks who advocated civil rights with schizophrenia and confining them with treatment. Treatments could become lifelong sentences without payroll. Along with many other state asylums, the hospital was justly closed down what is called an area of deinstitutionalization in the 1970s, which came result over the brutal outrage of psychiatric and social control. Changes in the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual for Mental Disorders, the DSM, gradually are increasing the use of psychiatric for evil purposes. It is considered the definite guide to mental illness. It has been through 5 editions since its 1952 first edition, including the removal of homosexuality as a mental illness. The latest edition defines oppositional defiant disorder, ODD. To be diagnosed with ODD, a person had to have the following behaviors for more than 6 months: angry mood, argumentative behavior, and vindicativeness. This definition is so broad that almost anyone can be diagnosed with it, especially those who argue with authorities of their days, and probably me on this podcast as well. It has become common for courts to order a mental evaluation of those in custody or in family court, whether or not those crimes, so-called crimes I should say, they're really victimless crimes mostly, are violent. A prominent example is the whistleblower Bradley Manning or Chelsea Manning. In a number of cases, authorities simply wish to punish a dissenter and discourage others from acting similarly. In October 9, 2010, headline in Raw Story read, "Cop hauled off to psych ward after alleging fake crime stats." New York Police Department officer Adrian Schoolcraft accused the supervisors of faking crime stats and ticket quotas to make them look better. He backed up his accusations with documents and hundreds of hours of recorded tape, which he supplied to the Associated Press. As a result of his alleged hostile behaviors, he was taken to handcuffs to a hospital for evaluation. Red flag laws are just simply a slippery slope for more tyranny. For those who believe in red flag laws are reasonable, it is important to know that once given power, those who receive it never get back. As Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing. Even more so, they use the power they have gained to limit any opposition to their rule. If red flag laws are put in place today, the red flags may be threatening language. Tomorrow they may be racism. Next week, there may be political disagreements. In a month, they may have any arguments at all. Next month, who knows? The goalposts are always moving. But in a system of tyranny, the definition of dissent is always changing. One of the most Orwellian bills today, lawmakers in New York have drafted a proposed bill that would require a review of citizens' social media as well as the search engine history going back years, just to buy a gun. Senate Bill 9191 would establish an official investigation officer who would probe the social media posts and search engine history of anyone attempting to purchase a gun. It also applies to current gun owners who want to renew their licenses. This would apply to New York State to demand accounts and passwords. If they find hateful speech, you could be denied. The New York Police Department could also deny your license simply if they feel like it as well, with no just cause. This sets a dangerous precedent for the rest of the country. This is an obvious violation of the freedom of speech and right to bear arms and the right to privacy. Saying men aren't women could be considered hate speech. Criticizing police brutality and speaking out against corrupt government officials could also be included in this broad definition. The Trump administration is also considering a proposal that will allow major tech companies like Google and Apple to monitor American citizens for sign of violent behavior and mental illness. This score could be used to determine if someone is allowed to own a firearm or not. This is shockingly similar to the social credit system of the Chinese Communist government. Devices such as Echo, Siri, Alexa could be used to monitor individuals for this purpose. These devices are always listening, including smartphones and other devices that are considered smart. And Alexa is always listening in these devices because if you, for example, you have to say, "Hey Alexa," and then it starts listening. Well, in order for it to hear "Hey Alexa," it has to be on all the time. Same with "Hey Siri" for Apple and "Hey Google" for Androids. So what you could do is you could get a case that blocks out EMFs and also recording sound. It's a phone case. It's I'll have it in the references, but I use one. And there's also a company called Mic Lock, and I'm not getting sponsored by these people, but you can block the microphone by plugging this thing in, and you can also, there's a version where you can block it and still listen to music or what else you are listening to on your phone. So that's one way you can still have a smartphone without having to worry about that issue. However, with the smart devices, as far as I know, you cannot disable the microphone unless you are change the hardware inside by like taking the Alexa apart and changing and swapping parts or whatever. But I would just recommend not having an Alexa device or any other similar smart home device. And also, they are listening when they're off too, potentially. But for sure, when they're on, they're always listening because they have to respond to your "Hey" command. When the government is allowed to make designations about individuals and restrict their rights, as a result, innocent people are always trampled. Recall the blacklist of the McCarthy era, where innocents were criminalized for mere accusation of being communist. Also remember the Japanese internment camps, where innocent Japanese people were imprisoned because of their race. What about the no-fly list, which without little due process and consistently incorrectly flags people who could be anywhere from 4-year-old and journalists, military veterans, and American Muslims who refused to be informants for the government. The ACLU explains innocent victims are unable to face their accusers with the source of the information that makes them a target, unable to see the information or the criteria by which it was judged, and have no meaningful way to appeal this status. Innocent people are often drowned in the appeals process and never gain their stolen property when it comes to red flag laws. In this next section, I'll be talking about the racist history of gun control. The Second Amendment was originally created in non-slave states to defend themselves against British disarmament and tyranny. Note that slaves weren't given the right to bear arms because the slave master would lose power over them. And a great example of this is the quelling of John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, and the same is also true for government as well. Self-defense is a powerful tool, and that's why the politically privileged in this country have so often sought to prevent the powers from realizing the full potential of autonomous self-defense. Throughout the antebellum, which means after war, South laws were put in place preventing both slaves and free black people from possessing guns. In fact, this went beyond beyond guns, with New Orleans outlawing slaves learning fencing and Maryland restricting freemen from even owning dogs of their own in case they could be used to attack the white population. So many of these laws were passed and the intention was clear: prevent self-defense. Upholding gun rights for freed slaves was a primary motive between the 14th Amendment. State-level gun control being instrumental in suppressing African Americans. During the late 19th and early 20th century, several southern states had enacted gun control laws that restricted access of cheap handguns to African Americans. In September 1954, a more ambitious proposal to require legislation of all firearms and records of all sales of ammunition came close to becoming law. Backers explicitly promoted the bill as part of a segregation-supporting legislation and linked it to the crackdown on civil rights. Conservative hero Ronald Reagan was a massive supporter of gun control when he was the California governor. The purpose of the Mulford Act of 1967 was the disarmament of the Black Panthers, an African-American self-defense community. It was noted that the organization was mostly peaceful organization until the late 1960s, when the CIA and law enforcement agents infiltrated the group to make it more terroristic. They openly carried, kept watch on police, and protested against the government. All, of course, are natural rights. Allen Brown, head of the Black Panther Party in the 1960s, recently explained, the position of the Black Panther Party was that black people live in communities occupied by police forces that are armed and dangerous, represent the front line of forces keeping us suppressed. We do not promote guns, rather, we promote the right to defend ourselves against the state which is oppressing us with guns. There were innumerable incidents in which police agents kicked in our door and shot our brothers and sisters in what we called red light trial, where the police was the judge, the jury, and the executioner. We called for an immediate end of this brutality, advocated for a right to self-defense. Today, the brutal police murders of Sean Bell in New York and Oscar Grant in Oakland are just two examples of how little has changed. The gun control discussion could result in policies that further criminalize and target black people. When Reagan, Nixon, and other Republicans in the 1960s advanced gun control, they were released in part pandering to the law and order conservatives who wanted police to have yet more power to protect them from minorities and the poor. If racism was not in their intent, it was definitely part of the effect. Even today, gun laws are much like drug laws in that they disproportionately used against minorities. Gun control is the chief reason behind New York City's Stop and Frisk program, which in 2011 Sarah targeted minorities by a ratio of 9-1. Conservatives who defend this program are defending gun control at its most evasive, the wholesale profiling and searching people in the attempt to procure guns, which conservatives claim people have the natural and constitutional right to carry in the first place. Liberals opposed to this program should recognize that to violate gun rights, government must violate other rights. In the federal prison system, almost half of those convicted for gun control violations are black and a quarter are Hispanic. Because of mandatory minimums for gun violation, the average convicted gun offender, usually someone who has never hurt anyone with their weapon, rots in prison for longer than the average convicted rapist and drug offender. Gun control bias are often done in minority areas. The left loves to talk about race. It's their calling card. When you look at the history of gun control in the United States, it has been used as a tool for racial oppression. And this goes back to the founding eras. Because naturally a lot of slave owners were scared of potential slave uprisings like they saw what happened in the Haitian Revolution in the early 1790s. So many states made sure not to only disarm slaves, but recently freed blacks. And the Nat Turner Revolt of the 1830s did catalyze a wave of gun control against blacks through the Deep South. And then you have the obvious Reconstruction era with black codes, which include gun control on recently freed slaves, and they were subject to potential lynchings and other abuses from groups like the KKK. The blacks also weren't the only ones affected. People tend to forget that the Japanese American internment camps of the 1940s, which FBR spearheaded, was part of the internment process, was the confiscation of firearms from these Japanese American in order to ensure their peaceful compliance. And to this day, although the gun control is not explicitly racist, it does proportionally hurt minorities who tend to be located in progressive urban centers like Baltimore, Washington, D.C., or Chicago, which have very draconian gun laws on the books. In the early 20th century, the Sullivan Act in New York banned the carrying of small firearms, which was likely targeted also at Italian immigrants. Most deadly violence committed by private citizens occur in areas suffering from institutionalized discrimination. Unofficial economic segregation leads to some areas getting the worst go of the most hostile police forces and a low-level investment and a large burden of environmental hazards. These are usually places where minority racial groups targeted by the bigotry of the powerful live. The Black Panthers recognize this. Their gun-toting swagger was part of the community improvement empowerment program. This next section is you can't be pro-gun rights and pro-cop. When can you shoot a cop? Cops don't really prevent crime. The courts have consistently ruled that the police have no obligation to protect individuals. In Morgan District in Columbia Metropolitan Police Department, the court stated, courts have, without exception, concluded that when a municipality or other government entity undertakes to furnish police services, it assumes a duty only to the public at large and not to individual members of the community. There is only one on-duty cop for every 1,813 citizens according to the U.S. Census Bureau 1999 estimate. 9% of the time, police arrive too late to prevent a crime or arrest the suspect, according to This is 9/11. Please hold. Laws and badges do not alter the rules of being a decent human being, and it is one of the most basic rules of the non-aggression principle. It says you shouldn't initiate violence against someone else. If someone attacks you, you have the right to defend yourself. You have the right to use whatever level of force it takes to stop him. If he continues escalating to the level of violence he's willing to use to attack you to commit aggression, you have the right to keep escalating the amount of violence you use to stop him, even if that requires killing him. The same is true for the right to kill civilians, and as well if the attacker has a badge. Whatever this is referring killing as defending yourself against violence, continuous assault, or the threat of lethal force. If you raise the question of the context of an act of aggression committed by someone with a badge, lots of people freak out. Isn't it ironic that cops have classes and have written policies and all the time are taught the concept of when they should shoot a civilian? And a lot of times it is similar to what you should do to protect your life, then you need to do it. If the civilian is attacking the cop defends himself, and the civilian ups the amount of violence he's using, the cop has the right to use the amount of defensive force that he's using, all the way up to point to killing a person if he has to do it to save his own life. But when cops say this about civilians, when civilians say that about each other, nobody has tantrums, and everybody understands attacking people is bad. Defending yourself is good, but whenever you talk about it in the context where the aggressor has a badge or is law enforcement and the one defending himself doesn't, he's breaking law, or he's just obeying the law and his attacker is breaking law with the badge. People freak out and they don't want to talk about it because they've been trained in the mindset that the virtuous way to is be do what you're told, obey the police, obey the law, out of authority, and never resist. Some people might say you're advocating murder. No, this is self-defense. If someone attacks you, you have the right to defend yourself. Whether he has a badge or not does not enter in the morality of the issue. People might make up excuses. Hey, cops people too. They're just doing their jobs and they're just trying to feed their families. Alright, let's see if it applies rationally to other people. The hitman is going on murdering people because he's paid to. He's the person who has a family. He's just doing his jobs. He has to try to feed his family. Come on, don't say you could shoot him. If a hitman is trying to kill him if necessary. If the hitman is trying to kill you and he has a badge, kill him. And the fact that some people literally can't think about this. The fact you can't talk about this in any context when an attacker has a badge shows just how thorough and authoritarian indoctrination is. Even though if you look at history, the amount of evil that's been done by aggressors with badges who call themselves law enforcement, they said they were acting on behalf of authority and government, dwarfs any other evil committed by private citizens going against the law. So the fact is that something is law does not make it okay. It does not make it legitimate unless you think Holocaust, wars, and oppression and torture are legitimate. Most people literally have been trained to not be able to think about the possibility of someone wearing the label of authority commits aggression. You have the same right to defend yourself as some guy off the street. If some civilian attacks you, you have the right to defend yourself. If the guy with a badge attacks you, he's still just a person. Morality still applies the same. You have the right to defend yourself. When should you shoot a civilian is the same as when should you shoot a cop. If your life is in danger, you're being attacked, you have the right to defend yourself. Laws do not change that and badges do not change that. The mythology of authority and government does not change that. And people are finally starting to ask themselves, at one point, should you actually resist aggression that's done in the name of law? If more people asked that throughout the last 10,000 years or so, there would have been a lot less suffering and injustice in the world. Supporting gun control laws means giving the government more credit than deserved. Government is an institution run and staffed people with own interests and personality. Are they really any smarter, more competent, or less likely to escalate violence than the average person? If anything, institutional interests and incentives combined with the difficulty of holding government actors accountable makes them more dangerous. The laws they enforce make them even a bigger threat to the public safety. Government workers with assault weapons breaking into people's homes if they're suspected of having unapproved medicine, haven't paid off the bank, or happen to live at the wrong address. If these government workers feel threatened during their general arrest, they are liable to shoot the terrified residents and their pets and get away with it. I wouldn't feel any safer knowing that these people are the only people who could buy 30-round magazines. Despite the tools of personal defense among peaceful citizens and communities make life safer by reducing the power of and the perceived need of militarized official protectors. There's a protest where a group of kids protested gun control, but at the same time they had Blue Lives Matter flags which support the police. It's a movement that basically supports police, whatever they do, and they do not care about, well, generally they do not care about holding them accountable. And one of the most important parts of the Second Amendment was completely missing, and that was the well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state mentioned in it. If gun control measures were passed, the same people who would be sent to enforce them are the people who support Blue Lives Matter. The purpose of the Second Amendment is to protection against standing armies, police state tyranny, and the security of a free state of existence. Oddly enough, many of these more radical leftist groups allies themselves with March for Our Lives, also allies themselves with the dangerous and various strains experience of the prison abolition and reform movements. Aside from calling to disarm state agents such as the police, these movements have contradictory goals. If we disarm the police, who will enforce gun control measures enacted against average citizens? Given this contradiction, much of the policy surrounding gun control in this segment of the left is muddled and conflicting. With many results, they call only for serving to expand the police state and increase incarceration. The police are not meant to be able to outgun the citizens. We didn't even have police forces really much until New York in the 1840s, and they were the most famous gangs that abused people. It's the citizens that are the real police, or the militia. The founding fathers would look at our modern police forces as standing armies. The police should not be allowed to outgun the common citizens. Because the common citizens are supposed to be functioning the militia, the militia is supposed to be a check and balance against standing armies. The police are standing armies, and clearly the militia should have firearms at least as good as the police have in case the police should go rogue, which they have. This next section is history of gun control in other countries. Throughout the history of the world, there have been despots, tyrants, dictators, and kings who have imposed will over those who conquer. After defeating rival armies in battle, many of these rulers went on to lead cruel, ruthless, and abusive regimes, largely by keeping the subjugated powerless to resist. In more recent times, the invention of mass production of firearms made conquering and then controlling entire populations much more difficult, which is why the most heinous despots in the last 150 years have moved to limit or ban access to guns. Pre-Soviet Russia had the right to bear arms, only restricting their usage, such as not shooting outdoors in crowded places unless it was necessary in 1845. Many Russians owned guns, even regular citizens. Soviet Russia put the end to this because they knew if they had all the guns, they could rule without resistance. Soviet Union was established following the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 when Tsar, which means basically Emperor, Nicholas II tossed 11 million Russian peasants into war. Frustrated and angered by the loss of life, multitudes of armed Russians, many current or former Russian soldiers who were led by Marxists Vladimir Lenin, rebelled against a ruling regime that was already teetering on the edge of collapse. Firearms were allowed to reign in the hands of Soviet citizens until 1923 when private gun ownership was abolished, a time which saw the rise of one of the most world's oppressive regimes that was led by Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin. He ruled from 1941 to 1953, but he was entrenched in the country's leadership by 1928. From 1929 to the year Stalin died, tens of millions of Soviet dissidents or anyone in the country's leadership that was believed to be a threat was rounded up and either murdered, placed in labor camps or prisons, and forced to work, sometimes to their death. In 1932 to 1933, Stalin engineered a famine by massively raising the grain quota that the peasantry had to turn over to the state. This killed between 6 and 7 million people and destroyed the Ukrainian resistance. His callous disregard for life was matched only by his paranoia. Later, he purged the Communist Party itself of anyone he believed to be a threat, all under the auspices of a total gunman. If the opposition disarms, well and good. If he refuses to disarm, we shall disarm it ourselves, he once said. Russia still has strict gun control laws, allowing only ownership of musket guns for hunting and sport and weak air guns for self-defense. The Ottoman Empire implemented gun control in 1911. A few years later, in the beginning of 1915 and lasting until 1917, some 1.5 million Armenians living within the empire were rounded up and murdered by the ruling class. It has been what's called the Armenian Holocaust. The Ottoman government established butcher battalions, which consisted primarily of violent criminals who had been released from prison just to kill ethnic Armenians. Those who were members of the army, which was currently fighting the Allies in World War I, were disarmed, placed in labor battalions, and then killed, said the University of History of Michigan. Weimar Republic passed various types of gun control legislation, specifically things like registration of firearms or requiring police permits to acquire firearms or to carry them. During the area of communist rebellions late in early 1910s and 1920s in the Weimar Republic, you could be shot on the spot for possession of a gun. For example, back when one of those revolts, they were shooting Red Cross nurses for gun possession. In 1928, the situation calmed down. In order to obtain a gun, you needed a license. Years later, in 1931, registration was being processed. When the Nazis took power, they began revoking license to those who were not political supporters of Nazism. In 1935, the police were told not to issue firearm permits to Jews. In 1938, Jews were disarmed. Because they were registered and the location of the Jews and their weapons were known, the Nazis could easily disarm them. If a Jew was caught possessing a gun, they could be sent to a concentration camp for 20 years. In the occupied territories, Germans gave the subject 24 hours to turn in their guns or face the death penalty. In 1935, France implemented gun registration, and 5 years later, the Nazis used that registration information to find out where the French held their guns when they occupied them and confiscated them. As you can imagine, the Nazis didn't want those they occupied to be able to resist, which is what the government does to its own citizens. Governments are essentially occupational forces, especially tyrannical ones that implement gun control. Also, as you can see, if a foreign power invades your country and you have a registry, it can be used against that country, even for the purpose of it was originally to benefit the home country, not the invaders. Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany established gun control in 1938, just prior to the implementation of its horrendous murderous campaign to exterminate Jews and others. In the end, 13 million Jews and other lesser perceived races were killed by Hitler and his Nazi party. The nationalist Chinese government established gun control in 1935, just 2 years before Japan Japan invaded in 1937. In the period from 1935 to 1952, some 20 million citizens and political dissidents were murdered. The Chinese Cultural Revolution, which was launched by the country's supreme ruler Mao Zedong, took place from 1966 to 1976 and claimed the lives of several million people and inflicted cruel and inhumane treatments on hundreds of millions of people. However, 40 years after it ended, the total number of victims of the Cultural Revolution, especially the death toll, mass killing, still remains a mystery both in China and overseas. The actual figures remain a highly classified state secret. Regarding gun control, Mao once said, "War can only be abolished through war. In order to get rid of the gun, it's necessary to take up the gun. And political power comes out of the barrel of a gun." Cambodia issued its gun control edict in 1956, but the real carnage did not begin until several years later during the regime of Pol Pot. Between 1975 and 1977, his regime murdered as many as 1 million educated people, religious, and those who wanted to keep their pre-communist Khmer culture. This plan was called Year Zero, which he believed he represented a threat to his power in killing fields that were later depicted in the movie of the same name. In all, 250 million people around the world in the 20th century have been murdered as a result of gun control laws imposed by rulers and despots who knew that the only way to continue to brutalize their own people and stay in power was by disarming them. However, this number is likely far higher. And now gun controllers, politicians, academics, and pundits who want our leaders to have the same ability to rule unopposed and unafraid of consequences. Brazil has some of the most violent cities in the world. Because of this, politicians have implemented gun control as a proposed solution. To own a firearm, you must at least 25, have a gun license, pay registration fees, and pass an extensive background check. Only 3.5% of Brazilians legally own guns due to gun control. In 2017, Brazil had a homicide rate of 30.8 per 100,000. Mexico also has strict gun control. Mexico only has one legal gun store. It's in the capital. Law-abiding citizens have a few options for self-defense. Those who wish must submit references and demonstrate that they earn their income legally. They also must be photographed and fingerprinted. Because few Mexicans own guns, criminals and drug cartels can easily terrorize them. 94 homicides happen daily in Mexico. Venezuela has never really had the legal right to bear arms, and Hugo Chavez's successors have basically destroyed legal gun ownership. In 2012, the Venezuelan government passed Control of Arms, Munition, and Disarmament Law. This gave the Venezuelan government more power over guns. This law was modified in 2012 to allow the Venezuelan armed forces to control, register, and confiscate firearms. Also in 2012, they banned the sale of firearms and ammo. This failed to stop crime. From 2012 to 2016, the murder rate from 73 per 100,000 to 92 murders per 100,000. Today, this number is likely far higher. This next section is called democide, which means death by government. Once a standing army is established in any country, the people lose their liberty. Recollect the history of most nations of the world. What havoc, desolation, and destruction have been perpetrated by standing armies. George Mason, co-author of the Second Amendment. And people say it can't happen in America. It can happen anywhere. It can happen here. Wherever you live in the world, it can happen. If it's more than, one person, it could literally happen. And, people in countries like Germany, they thought it couldn't happen here. They thought in Russia it couldn't happen here. They thought in Japan it couldn't happen here. They thought in Cambodia it couldn't happen here. So don't think that your country is immune to becoming tyrannical. Any country can become completely tyrannical. Operation Urban Warrior is a drill where the U.S. military practices going door to door, rounding up people in Oakland neighborhoods and forcing them into concentration camps. Actors who took part of the drill yelled that their Americans have rights while being led to barbed wire holding areas. Beginning in 1999, the government entered into contracts with Kellogg Brown and Root KBR to build detention camps at undisclosed locations for the United States, which are often called FEMA camps. The government also has contracted with several companies to build thousands of rail cars, some reportedly equipped with shackles, ostensibly to support the transportation of detainees. According to a diplomat and author Peter Dale Scott, the KBR contract is part of Homeland Security plan titled Endgame, which sets as its goal the removal of all aliens and potential terrorists. Note that most Americans would be considered potential terrorists according to FBI if you believe in conspiracies, support limited government, and gun rights. We must also realize the fact that Barack Obama's political mentor, weather underground specialist terrorist Bill Ayers, had plans for U.S. political dissenters to be re-educated in detention camps. However, Ayers realized that not everyone could be re-educated, so he believed that approximately 25 million Americans need to be exterminated. Part of Homeland Security has purchased over 1.6 billion rounds of ammo, which most of it is hollow point that are not used for target shooting, and even violates the Geneva Convention. An estimated 262 million have been killed in their own governments in the 20th century, according to Hawaii.eu/power kills. In previous centuries, it was estimated to be 133 million. This would total for 0 AD to 1900s. This does not include BC, and that is a low estimate as well, but an estimated 395 million people have been killed by their own governments. Historic precedents of this kind are depressing numerous. We cannot open a history textbook and pick even a decade in which genocide and government oppression of all civilians were absent. Where most people are defenseless, even small numbers of ill-meaning agents of a government or organized criminal group have murdered thousands with impunity. Historic evidence shows clearly what happens when government agents are permitted to abuse defenseless individuals. We also know that mere ability to resist usually functions as effective deterrents to gross abuses of human rights. For some reason, one issue doesn't come up in the discussion of well-meaning people who wish to save lives, to see lives saved by gun control. Since most murders are committed by governments which have official support, why isn't anyone trying to take away the machine guns and tanks and the known violators of human rights? Why is a law-abiding man with the rifle viewed as a bigger threat than a confirmed psychopath with access to more serious weapon in the history of using them against innocents, such as law enforcement and the military? What happens when self-defense is against the law? What happens when the protectors become the predators? What happens when innocents are betrayed? Imagine that 2/3 of all Americans disappear. That's 170 million people. And the countries of Germany, France, and Spain are wiped off the map. In the 20th century, that's how many people were killed, tortured, starved, mutilated, worked to death, bayoneted, hanged, and annihilated in the hands of government. They had no means of defending themselves. A government is little more than a group of people have been able to amass enough power to command and kill the rest of the people around them, if deemed necessary. It was always moved by the part of government to restrict the liberty of the people to make them easier to control. That's something you can see throughout history. When you look at the excessive persecution of governments throughout history, it really is mind-boggling. The vast majority of people, once they realize they're incapable of resisting government, the will to resist usually falls pretty quickly. Governments have killed about 262 million citizens in the past century, and mass shooters have killed about 414 citizens in the past century. If these statistics are correct, this means governments has killed 633,000 times more citizens than mass shooters. So who's the bigger risk, armed citizens or armed government agents, especially those of tyrannical governments? When you disarm a population, you leave them open to the worst criminals of all, which are the government criminals. There have been more deaths to genocide and done by government agents in the 20th century than all the wars put together. When you compare the deaths that have been committed by individual criminals, they are compared to the carnage, death, and destruction and the murder that has taken place by governments. But the gun control lobby and the mainstream always fail to mention this. Any body of the citizens that can respond to mass shootings can also respond to tyrannical government. Mass killings, the psychopaths, are in the hall of tyrannical governments and off the public schools. 98% of mass shooters in America take place in gun-free zones. You would think that with such an experience going way back in 1915, we might conclude that gun-free zones are actually murder magnets. If you think the government can be trusted with power weapons, why do you think civilians can't be? As the hundreds of thousands of people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki have been affected by atomic bombs if they trust the U.S. military with nuclear weapons and other powerful weaponry, such as bombs and planes. As the millions killed overseas in the U.S. military with military-grade weapons, if they trust them with military weapons. In reality, your average Joe is less likely to accidentally kill someone with a firearm than a cop, 2% versus 11% for the police officer, when using a gun to defend themselves and other innocent. The U.S. government, police, and military, they're private mercenary, and all governments in the world kill more than private murder. If these zones are generalized enough, they could theoretically be expanded to encompass the entire nation, if not the world. That is what the gun controllers are trying to do. And the way mass shooters often think is if they see a gun-free zone, they know that they can inflict much carnage because no one will be able to stop them. And the same is also true for replace the mass shooter with a tyrannical government and the gun-free zone as gun control, and the analogy still applies. If the Second Amendment is to guarantee a free state, then why are we approaching a police state, which I explained in immense detail in episode 4, Police Security Agencies and Big Tech Surveillance. There's an ideology called collectivism, which is the idea that people must serve the state. In order for people to serve the state, they must not have the means of defending themselves or rebelling against it. And they may get ideas or have the means to do so if they have the ability to defend against the state and its tyrannies. This next section is how gun rights can refit democide and tyranny and how gun control assisted. The strongest reason for people to retain the right to keep and bear arms is as a last resort to protect themselves against tyranny and government. This is often attributed to Thomas Jefferson. The most foolish mistake we could make would be to allow the subject races to possess arms. History shows that all conquerors who have allowed their subject races to carry arms have prepared their own downfall by doing so. Indeed, I would go as far as to say that the supply of arms to the underdogs is a sine qua non, or an ingredient for the overthrow of any sovereignty. So let's not have any native militia or native police. German troops alone will bear the sole responsibility for the maintenance of law and order through the occupied Russian territories, and a system of military strongpoints must be evolved to cover the entire occupied country. This was by Hitler, which he planned for how he wanted to govern the Russian territories. Politicians obviously cannot plead ignorance to the crime statistics of their own agency, so why are they always pushing to disarm the public? Well, the emotionalism and cries about saving the children from people would know well that the danger to innocent people increases when the good people are disarmed. Obviously, some sociopath who doesn't doesn't mind violating laws against assault murder won't mind violating gun laws either. By definition, gun control only disarms the law-abiding. The politicians know this, so why do they keep pushing for it when they know it will increase violent crime? First, let's be clear about what gun control really is. Gun control is not about doing away with guns. It's about making it so only the cops and soldiers have guns. Have you ever heard any politicians suggesting that his enforcers and protectors be disarmed? Their goal is not to make guns disappear, but to create a huge imbalance of power with government agents remaining heavily armed, everyone else left helpless. The politicians know that would make you and me safer, far from it. So what's their agenda? Government is about control. By way of taxation, you're forced to fund the political scenes. Whenever they enact a law, they aren't asking the United States to behave a certain way. They're ordering you to do or not to do certain things with the threat that their hard force will punish you if you disobey. They don't care. You will pay up. Eventually they'll send their men with guns to take your property or put you in prison. This is true for so-called gun control laws as well. If some peaceful, moral person owns a gun for self-defense, after the politicians declare it to be illegal, what happens to him? Other men with guns will show up and use violence or the threat of violence forcibly take that person's hostage. In reality, so-called gun control is gun violence. It's obvious why those in power want their enforcers to be armed, so you can force your subjects to obey you. It should be obvious by the last thing the controllers want is for you to possess the means to resist their enforcers. As people get more and more upset about those in Washington are doing and more inclined to resist, it should come no surprise that those in government are becoming more and more desperate to disarm people. They don't care if you don't want to protest, but they do care if you disobey. And they know that if they had all the guns, it would be a lot easier to keep you subservient and obedient. You may not like hearing this. You may want to believe the rhetoric. We're talking about the politicians representing and serving us, supposedly, and we're in charge, as if they care about what we think. But deep down, you know it's a lie. You know that if you don't do what they're told, their presence and their armed force will be waiting for you to do, and if you still want to pretend that they work for you. In recent years, those in power have engaged in more and more fear-mongering regarding so-called assault weapons, military assault rifles. What you won't hear from the politicians, but what the government's own crime statistics show, is that such weapons are used in only a tiny percentage of crimes. So why do politicians focus on them so much? Such firearms are not ideal for the common criminal since it is expensive, unwieldy, and difficult to conceal, which is why common criminals hardly ever use them. However, such weapons are ideal for a very different purpose, resisting government, and that is why politicians despise them and fear them. They aren't worried about the common criminal who might victimize you. They're worried about you having the means of resisting their attempts to control you. If you doubt this, take a look at how the government has recently been characterizing people as potential terrorists merely for objecting to high taxation or opposing gun control or protesting other authoritarian power grab. And sure, if you value freedom, then those who think it's their place to dominate and control you view you as your enemy. So doesn't it make perfect sense that they would want you to be disarmed? If this is sounding too radical or scary to you, keep in mind this is why the Second Amendment was written. Even with the Constitution in place, the founders still thought it was ultimately the job of the people, not any legitimate not any legislator or court to decide when the government has gone too far and to force resistance if necessary. So is any wonder that the last American ruling now views anyone who talks too much about the Constitution and Declaration of Independence as a positive terrorist? If you're retired, how would you want to view people who are cheering for a document which says that the people have the duty to alter or abolish any government which becomes violate in individual rights? Some who still celebrate the American Revolution as a noble victory for freedom argue that the oppression of the U.S. is not as bad as to justify forceful resistance again. But by any objective measure, what the United States ruling class is inflicted upon the people now is far worse than anything King George ever did. Taxation levels 10 times higher and far more intrusive and vulnerable than they were before the revolution. Government bureaucracy, regulators, and enforcers interfering in the lives in 1,000 ways that the British Crown can never dream of. Yet Americans still celebrate the 4th of July while making excuses why today they wouldn't dream of disobeying the ruling class. Many will insist that as long as we have a constitution, as long as we're allowed to protest, especially as long as we're alive, there will be never a need to resort to outright resistance. Unfortunately, history shows that such an opinion is misguided. When Mao Zedong was in power and communist China, the most murderous regime in history, people had a constitution which said that they had the right to protest, petition, and allow them to vote. When Joseph Stalin was in power in Soviet Russia, second most murderous regime in history, the people had a constitution which said that they had the right to protest and petition and allowed them to vote. When the Nazi Party was elected to power in Germany, people had a constitution which said they had the right to protest and petition and allowed them to vote. Today in North Korea, one of the most brutal, oppressive regimes on the planet, the people still have a constitution which says they have the right to protest and petition and allows them to vote. What all those others constitution does not include, though, was the right people to arm. The lesson to be learned here is that constitution words maybe do not stop tyranny, being allowed to protest and do not stop tyranny. So what does Patrick Henry, who gave the famous "Give me liberty or give me death" speech, answers that question, saying that when it comes to liberty, nothing will preserve it but downright force, adding that whenever you give up that force, you are ruined. Interesting, the 3 worst mass murders in history seem to agree. Mao Zedong declared the Communist Party must command all the guns. That way, no guns could ever be used to command the party. Joseph Stalin proclaimed, and if the opposition disarms, well and good, but if we refuse to disarm, we should disarm it itself. Adolf Hitler stated the most foolish mistake would be to allow the subject races to possess arms, as I said before. And if you want to know what happens when authoritarian regimes succeed in disarming, all you need to do is open a history book. This is what the world looks like when the good people are not armed. Tyranny has never been ended, and freedom has never been achieved by asking nicely. Frederick Douglass summed up the truth quite well when he says, "Power concedes nothing without a demand." It never did, and it never will find out just what the people will submit to, and you have found the exact amount of justice or wrong that would be imposed upon them. And these will continue until they resist us with either words or blows or both. History has shown us just how true that authoritarian power concedes nothing without a demand. And if government forces have these and the people's don't, only one side of the position will be able to demand anything. Similarly, the school to prison pipeline has rightly been condemned by leftists for its role in mass incarceration. School zero tolerance policies are a big part of the problem. These policies insist that schools should resort to suspicion, expulsion, and or legal actions against students for violent or potentially violent acts, including bringing weapons or drugs to school. Zero tolerance policies were in fact implemented in the 90s in response to growing concerns over school shootings were meant to target gun violence in schools. And so they have led many kids being expelled over petty fights and other normal youth aggression, as well as for things like habitual destruction, disrespect, and playing with fake or imaginary weapons, which of course facilitate guns are bad type propaganda. Finally, mandatory minimum sentences have long been fought against by those concerned about prisoners' rights. Mandatory minimums increase the rates of mass incarceration, resulting in longer sentences for many types of crime, including those involving firearms. In most states, there are mandatory minimums for any crimes involving firearms, no matter how petty the crime or how the firearm was used or not used. There are even mandatory minimum sentences for those caught possessing firearms illegally, even if they did not commit a crime with said firearm. This means that even if you're carrying a firearm on your person, can potentially lead you to a longer prison sentence than if you are caught doing anything else illegal or if you do not have proper licensing. Of course, the question becomes when you should shoot a cop. This makes most well-trained sentences go mad. They will say it's never okay to rebel against law enforcement, even though the red coats were law enforcement during the American Revolution. In the ideal world, cops would only be there to protect others, and shooting them wouldn't be justified. However, in the real world, law enforcement in many countries, including modern-day America, are the prime causes of violence, theft, injustice, and murder in the name of enforcing the law. Look at documentaries of people being rounded up in Soviet Russia or Nazi Germany and are about to be fired upon when they should shoot a law enforcer. Human history would have been much more peaceful if these thugs operating under fake law, aka man's law, were resistant, even if killed if necessary. Many people can easily see the oppression and tyranny of other countries, but not their own. This is the role of nationalism and false patriotism. Loyalty to the criminal politicians and law enforcement agency what blinds them from the truth. The idea of rebelling against police is unthinkable to many. Anyone who resists such a system is called a terrorist or criminal, when in reality anyone who fights against evil done by anyone, even police, should be called heroes because they are. Those who fight for freedom, such as an American revolutionaries, fight illegally against the breaches monarchy and its agents. A politician thinks they have the right to impose any law they want. Cops have the attitude that as long as it's called law, they will enforce it. Elections or petitions to the politicians do not stop tyranny. The Soviet Union and Nazi Germany had elections and the right of petition, and it didn't stop their law enforcement from genociding the population. What they did, they called law, they legislated, and then they had their law enforcement go out and implement evil. When tyrants define what counts as law, then by definition, it is up to the lawbreakers to break and destroy that tyranny. Pick any example of abuse of power, or its fascist, so-called war on drugs, the police thuggery that has become so common, the random stops and searches now routinely carried out in the name of security, such as in airports, border checkpoints that aren't even at the border, sobriety checkpoints, and so on. If it's wrong for cops to do these things, does that imply that you have the right to resist such actions? And of course, state mercenaries won't take kindly to being resistant, even non-violently. If you question their right to retain you, interrogate you, search you, invade your home, you will very likely be tasered, physically assaulted, kidnapped, put in a cage, or shot. If a cop decides to treat you like livestock, whether he does it legally or not, you will have only two options: submit or kill the cop. You can't resist a cop just a little and get away with it. You will always call in more of his fellow gang members until you're subdued or dead. You either have an obligation to let law enforcement have their way with you, or you have a right to stop them from doing so, which will always almost require killing them. Politely asking law enforcement to stop enforcing the law has a very poor track record throughout history. Consider the recent Indiana Support Cream ruling, which declared that if a cop tries to illegally enter your home, it's against the law for you to do anything to stop him. Aside from the patent absurdity of it, since it amounts to giving thugs with badges permission to break the law and makes it a crime for you to defend yourself against a criminal if he has a badge. To be blunt, if you have the right to do it, it means that if someone tries to stop you from doing it, even if he has the badge and a politician had scribbled called law on a sign, you have to use whatever amount of force is necessary to resist that person. If you have the unalienable right to speak your mind, all the Second Amendment or whatever rights, then if all else fails, you have the right to kill government agents who try to shut you up, disarm you, invade your privacy, etc. What's the alternative? If you do not have the right to forcibly resist so-called legal injustice, that logically implies that you have an obligation allow government agents to do absolutely anything they want to you, your home, your family, your neighbors, and so on. Really, there are only two choices. You are a slave to the property of the politicians without any rights at all, or you have the rights to violently resist government attempts to oppress you. There can be no other option. Of course, on a practical level, openly resisting the gang called government is very hazardous oftentimes. But there's a big difference between obeying for the sake of self-preservation, which is often necessary and rational, and feeling a moral obligation to go along with whatever the ruling class wants you to do, which is pathetic and insane. Most of the incomprehensible atrocities that have occurred throughout history were due in large part to the fact that most people never answer to the question of when should you shoot a cop. The correct answer is when evil is legal and becomes criminal, when oppression is enacted as law, become a lawbreaker, and when those violently victimized innocents have badges, become a cop killer. So the next time you hear of a police officer being killed in the line of duty, take a moment to consider the very real possibility that in many cases the law enforcement was the bad guy and the cop killer was a good guy. And as it happens, there has been case more often than not through history. Patrick Henry said, "Give me liberty or give me death." When he spoke up liberty, he said, "Nothing will preserve it but downright force. When you give up that force, you're ruined," as I said before. Alexander Hamilton said, "If circumstances should at any time oblige the government to form an army of any magnitude, that army can never be formidable to the liberties of the people, while there is a large body of citizens little, if at all, inferior to them in their discipline and use of arms, who stands ready to defend their rights and those of their fellow citizens. This appears to me the only substitute that can be devised for a standing army, which is the police in modern day, and the best possible security against it, if it should exist." Noah Webster said, "The United States cannot enforce unjust laws by the sword, because the whole body of people are armed and constitute a force superior to any band of regular troops that can be, on any pretense, raised in the United States." There was a particularly rebellious document called the Declaration of Independence. It says that whenever a government becomes destructive to individual liberties, it is the right and duty of the people to alter and abolish it. You can't alter or abolish a government that is destructive to individual liberty by asking nicely. You must resist them. They shot at law enforcement, which were the Redcoats. An example is the Battle of Lexington, where the Redcoats said, "Give up your guns," and the revolutionaries didn't. The Supreme Court of the United States ruled in John Bad Elk versus the United States, where they ruled that using even deadly force against a law enforcer, if he's acting outside his authority, isn't a crime at all. Here's what some Americans believe. Citizens who want to use firearms should become law enforcement because ordinary citizens don't need guns, as them having guns does not serve the state. Heinrich Himmler said that, which is the right-hand man of Hitler. The Republican Party and conservatives tend to care about the Second Amendment. If you cannot enter the discussion at what point would you resist by force, then you don't believe in the Second Amendment, especially if a law enforcement agent is taking away your guns. You have the right to resist, or at least not stop those who truly believe in the Second Amendment. You don't believe what the founders believe. The Second Amendment wasn't written so if things get bad, you can run off. It was written so if things get really bad, the people can kill government agents. It's not a pleasant topic, but if you're too much of a coward to think about it and talk about it, and you think, oh, just run away or do what you're told, you'll be a slave forever. If you really and truly believe that you never have the right to stand up against oppression, as long as it's called law, you're doomed. You will never be free. You're not even free inside your own head. If you're one of those people who think that's horrible, if you even discuss using physical violence against law enforcement, don't pretend you believe in freedom. Don't pretend you believe in undeniable rights. Don't pretend you believe in the Bill of Rights and the Second Amendment, because you don't. If you really are in the mindset that whatever government does to you is never okay to forcibly resist, you are a slave and you'll be a slave forever. Some people laugh and ask if small arms could have changed history. If the 6 million Jews who perished during World War II had a rifle for every one of the 500,000 combatants they could field, would they still ended up being slaughtered so efficiently? If they had mortars and light machine guns typical of contemporary military infantry, would they have been murdered at all? Ownership of weapons makes genocides much more difficult to commit, but it takes effective weapons to stop genocides entirely. William Blackstone, the founder's legal mentor, argued that the right to self-defense is meaningless unless the citizen was able to effectuate that self-defense. The right of self-defense is inherent in the natural rights of men. These rights are granted by the Creator. Now, the only way you can maintain your life in this world where there's a lot of evil is very often engaged in vigorous self-defense and the protection of yourself, your family, your property, your home, and your country. And I don't mean nation when I say country. I mean the people in the land. It's only that people who stand up against it, who see the brute force inherent in all government, the people who went along with slavery when it was legal, they didn't get in trouble. People who saw it that it's evil and say, we're not going to put up with that. I don't care if you call it law. We're not going to put up that. They're the ones who saw the violence inherent in the system. This next section is the fear of rebellion. Most people are afraid of righteous rebellion because they believe they couldn't fight the government and win. They will say things like, you can't fight the government with AR-15s. The U.S. Army War College analysis have published literature on the effectiveness of small arms in urban and asymmetric warfare, the most probable tactic to be used against a tyrannical government. These tactics are often ignored by arms strategists and opponents of the Second Amendment who are too cowardly to take up arms in the first place. They believe compliance with tyrants will somehow keep them safe long term, but that coward strategy never really works out, as history showed with those who comply with tyrants. People fear the freedom that rebellion would cause if it they were to succeed. Freedom means total responsibility. Most do not want to be responsible for their own actions, even though in reality this is the case. Freedom has not been experienced by most, which is why it is fear. It is a fear of the unknown. People are afraid of the sacrifices that may be required to gain freedom. If you won't fight for freedom, you do not love yourself. This is called self-loathing. If you won't fight for freedom, you don't really love your children. Most people who are too cowardly stand up to the violence and coercion of government, no matter how many rights taken away. Most people have chosen comfortable slavery over potentially dangerous freedom, though government is always dangerous. They've done this because priorities and values are based on false beliefs. There's no value in life without freedom. The value of physical safety does not ultimately matter. Being free doesn't mean you always will be safe, but being enslaved always means that you're definitely not safe. Yet those who value safety over freedom should not be able to understand this contradiction. Most people love their possessions too much to fight for freedom. Possessions, jobs, property mean nothing if you're a slave. If you are a slave, you're not own anything anyways. This fosters cowardice in action. We already have nothing left to lose. There has to be a line in the sand where we say no and no further. When no is not enough, that is what the defensive use of firearms are for. Life is not worth continuing to live if we are not free. Protecting rights and freedom is more important than physical safety or even survival. Unfortunately, people love comfort more than freedom. In the face of tyranny, cowards always search for safety, while good people search for freedom. Even if death is probable or certain, cowards choose to embrace evil or join their forces or to appease them, insisting they are too powerful and can't be beaten. Cowards won't fight for freedom because they discard their principles at the first sign of danger. Cowards see the military as unbeatable and the military as police. The cowards always choose to remain passive, which will result they become complicit in evil. Good people always develop the ability to fight for their freedoms and right, whatever the odds may be. Only a completely immoral coward would say, let slavery continue to reign just because death might be the alternative. There are some things in life that are worse than death, and slavery is one of them. The response of cowards is always that we can't fight tyranny because we might lose. A righteous rebellion is not waged because there is a significant chance of winning. Proper motivation is that slavery is morally wrong and should not be allowed to continue, no matter the cost. Real rebels don't care if they might die. They don't fight because they only desire to survive. They fight because they would rather fight and die than accept slavery. This is what liberty death means. Liberty death are options. It means that the instinct for preservation of freedom overcomes the instinct for the preservation of life. If you fight, you might lose. If you don't, you have already lost. By Bertolt Brecht. Fear is the passion of slaves, as Patrick Henry said. The fear of death is the beginning of every form of slavery. Those who believe in physical material existence as the only reality generally exists in continuous state of the fear of death. Because such individuals hold that material as prime, ignore or downplay any spiritual existence, they're almost always afraid to fight for freedom. They fear death because they don't know who they are. They deny the spirituality inherent in freedom and don't understand anarchy as the intrinsic state of free being. This is why the eternal great work of consciousness is the foundational work of a sovereign being and the ultimate solution to slavery. True consciousness means knowing who you are and who the enemy is. It means knowing your surroundings and the nature of the situation you exist in. It means understanding that you're not just a physical body, but a spiritual being have physical experience for the purpose of learning and growing spiritually. One of the main reasons people fear rebellion is that they may be killed. There is no such thing as death. We're ultimate energy. Energy can never be created nor destroyed, only transferred according to the law of conservation. So when someone dies, the energy simply goes elsewhere. Even if it were not true, you would simply cease to exist and you experience nothingness, similar to being asleep with no dreams or if you were under anesthesia. Real people don't fear rebellion. Cowards do. They do not put their life before freedom. I do not fear death. I have been dead for billions and billions of years before I was born, and have not suffered the slightest inconvenience from it. Mark Twain. The fear of death is the beginning of slavery. Robert Anton Wilson. Some believe you're not going to protect yourself from the government because the government has jets, tanks, and vessels. They say you're not going to do anything with your AR-15, you idiot. This makes the case for legalization, actually, for more military-grade weapons. Look at it like some of the cases of asymmetric warfare that the U.S. has found itself mired in. Right. It's the last wars against countries that have possessed a significant deficit in terms of military technology. You had like peasants with just mere rifles fight off people. And if you're able to coordinate correctly, it might not guarantee you victory, but it gives you a fighting chance. If you're disarmed, there's no way you're going to win. Some examples of using small arms like rifles to repel the advanced U.S. military is in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq. In the Red Dawn movie, the premise was that the Soviets had invaded the United States, and this group of teenagers in Colorado is escaping to the mountains from a few rifle and eventually created a resistant movement. It's obviously a movie, and it's fictionalized, but it's pretty realistic in some sense, because if you have a few weapons and you have the capacity and capability of preparing more weapons. For pacifists, even if you don't wish to engage in forceful revolution, should not mean that you shouldn't. Gandhi, who used nonviolent resistance, said it's important to have the means because they had to. If you can defend yourself, then you have the power, and you need to practice nonviolence side of the position of power. That's what happens when you have an armed society. When you don't, it's easy to round up people that you want to have round up. The option of physical rebellion for social attain has been largely abandoned. When most speak of revolution nowadays, it's quote-unquote intellectuals and help foster politically correct agendas. Revolutions such as MLK's and Gandhi's revolution, which were largely peaceful, are praised in school and the media, while the Revolutionary War, at least not as much, is often misrepresented. Gandhi's revolution was not successful until the Indians began to fight the British. Civil rights movement in America was halfway manipulated by the CIA and FBI via COINTELPRO infiltrations. The philosophy of peace has come to include a distaste for self-defense. Self-defense is now equated with violence and immoral, even though this is not the case. Even those who care about liberty, often called libertarian or classic liberals, often see physical defense as barbaric or futile. The problem with many libertarians is they get caught up with philosophies of Ayn Rand or Rothbard while abandoning the possibility of physical resistance. Some call this egghead libertarians. For the egghead libertarian, the war against tyranny must be fought only on the intellectual battlefield. They believe that by presenting a better, more logical philosophy, it will win over the soulless psychopaths, such as a majority of common soldiers who create tyranny. It sounds like it is out of the art of war, but it's really an excuse to avoid the riskiness of rebellion. They would have no experience or respect for self-defense and revolution. They cannot even fathom what it would entail. This unknown scenario inspires fear, particularly the fear of struggle, failure, and death. While taking action from a position of love of others is noble, it is not enough to face fear, pure evil. It is important to keep one foot in the ground of dissent. There are limitations of what peaceful resistance can accomplish depending on the opponent. Ironically, pacifists feel morally superior to us and want to force their so-called pacifism on others. They will determine and attack self-defense on the fact that they perceive preparation for self-defense as aggression. They will continue to do this until the movement is held to their high standard of pacifism. So everyone in the movement is held to the high standard of pacifism. Many pacifists care more about the feelings of moral superiority over others by being pacifists than they care about peace themselves. This is also called virtue signaling. Anyone who makes self-defense taboo is delusional and ignores natural law. They are likely also doing so because they enjoy a sense of social superiority. Physical self-defense against tyranny is not only necessary but entirely honorable. When the violence of an individual is thwarted by defense, when a potential thief robs the wrong house, when a rape is prevented by an unarmed and prepared woman, or when a potential murderer is shot dead by a citizen who refused to be a victim, our society cheers. When someone suggests that the same measure be taken against a violent, corrupt government, people suddenly claim moral hazard. There's no difference between defending yourself against a common criminal and defending yourself against a criminal government. Self-defense is a moral imperative more vital to the survival of peace and freedom than any other. Pacifists claim that physical revolution is useless, only result in tragedy for the participants. This is a product of nihilism and not rationalism. There is clearly a defeatist mentality that stems from cowardice rather than logic. Nihilism destroys all hope. It essentially denies success before an action is even done. Nihilists ensure that their own failure, since every scenario will result in loss. Nihilists see others as blind optimists and themselves realists. Self-defense advocates are more realistic. When optimists see problems, they look for solutions, and if they can't, they continue to do so. There's always a solution to any problem. The odds of success are not relevant when revolution against the absolute evils of tyranny is concerned. Odds don't matter in the revolution for freedom. You will be likely confronted with two choices: fight and possibly die at the hands of tyranny, or surrender and become a slave and probably still die at the hands of tyranny. Either way, we're not moral beings, so who cares if you die? At least you died fighting for something real. The Creator doesn't favor well those who let evil run amok. Physical revolution requires adaptability and courage. Fear and nihilism has no place. Many argue that because our enemies are technologically superior, that physical rebellion is useless. That argument can also be made for non-violent revolution, as the media has technological superiority over grassroots activism for freedom. Some in the literary movement says that revolution is a poor option for defeating tyranny because of the cyclical nature of political change. Revolutions will fight a tyrannical government, then implement their own, often more brutal government. This is often true. This is not the fault of the idea of revolution. The problem with just revolutions such as the American Revolution is that they did not go far enough. No revolution has ever removed the elitist cabal that secretly runs their government, often hidden or operating in foreign places. Neither have they completely eliminated the idea of statism and legitimacy of government. Perhaps this is why revolutions are called revolutions in the first place. Knowledge of these elites was not always widespread, but because of the internet, most of mankind has access to this knowledge. One can simply look up the roster of organizations like Bilderberg, Tavistock, the Trilateral Commission, the Council on Foreign Relations, the International Monetary Fund, and the Bank of International Settlements, etc. At least in the Liberty Movement, we know who the real enemy is. Your revolution being infiltrated, which is called coercion, is only possible if you don't know the real enemy. A revolution to remove Obama or Trump would be useless because presidents are nothing but puppets. If you are not striking to remove the problem will go back. Co-option often happens when people become obsessed with top-down leadership rather than decentralized resistance. If you wait for the next George Washington, you'll eventually get him, but he might not be who he seems. Beware of generals and the notions of a military coup. But any revolution that uses political party vision, such as conservative revolution or a liberal revolution. Beware of financial interests such as central banking wishing to fund your revolution. Some say revolution will solve nothing because of the corrupt nature of humanity, and if we remove one set of elites, another will be replaced. This is defeatist garbage propagated by nihilists. We have no idea what life would be like without globalist elites. They have never been removed for a single generation. They have existed for a century. Many of the same bloodlines, such as the monarchies of Europe, are still in control. They go back at least to the Babylonians and Sumerians. The American Revolution was the closest thing to removal of the global elite, and it resulted and America become the most free and prosperous nation in the world, which is why the globally are trying to destroy the Bill of Rights, which helps this country be so great. The globalists must be ruined. Bad men will still exist, but they will not be as advanced and well organized to rule covertly or with an iron fist as globalists. Their methods of social engineering will not be as advanced, and many of their secrets will be exposed. The fear of rebellion has been bred out of men, especially men, and also women as well. They have become domesticated and emasculated. They beat around the bush, they are soft, and most of them are cowards. If you say anything about rebellion, how immoral government is, they look at you like a frightened dog. Oh my gosh, he's talking about this. How can I get out of this conversation? I'm too scared to talk about this. Half of society is cheering on the state, the other is too cowardly to do anything about it. Until people you associate yourself with understand the morality of government and refuse to associate themselves with the state, you should cut them from your life. People's minds are shaped by men they do not know of and often never will. That's why people find life so difficult, live in quiet desperation, and they're battling against the forces of good in the universe and going against the flow of life. The universe rewards those with courage. That's why the globally and dark cult is winning. Evil people in our world on average will have more courage than good people, so the universe rewards them. The globally don't do any physically harmful behavior most of the time. They get their order following police and military to do their dirty work. That is why they're able to escape some of the karmic consequences for evil in the physical world. If you align your thoughts, emotions, and actions together effectively, you'll get whatever you want, even if the intent is control and the emotions are of hatred. People are afraid to speak out. They will argue. What will my family and friends think? What will this government agency come after me? The only reason you care about this is because you are a coward who doesn't want to care about freedom and stopping evil. Do not worry about who's listening, tracking your activities. For one, do not fear these people. They are spiritually dead. If anything, those listening and trying to your work, such as government agency and big tech giants, might learn something by listening to you and wiretapping you. Courage is not the absence of fear. If you are completely fearless, you can be reckless. Courage is moving forward with what you're doing, even if you're fearful. Sometimes the fear doesn't go away, and the only way to get rid of it is to go through the fearful experience with courage. This fear stops others from taking rightful actions, from learning and from putting information to help others understand. As soon as rebellion is spoke of, they shut down. People have a total fear that cuts them off from what they want to be doing, but often what they need to be doing. There are many people who would do a good job with conveying information because they have a mind to take it in, info, and process it and then deliver it. I believe we're all capable to an extent, and that we can present certain information in a certain way. We are put on this earth for a certain purpose, to learn a lesson and propagate the message of true love and freedom and truth in our own way. Most have been diverted and distracted from this message. Fear is also another reason for this. They've been told that this mission is not the true purpose, and that the true purpose is designed to serve the system. Many light occultists think courage is more important than knowledge. It takes courage to even look into this info and understand what is going on. They're especially afraid to act upon receiving knowledge of truth. They are afraid of how bad things are and how ugly the truth can be. Our ancestors worked so hard to teach us about the truth, which they were often killed for. Now people discard their info. One example is the founding fathers. They built a pocket of freedom and total global slavery. Now over the generations, tyranny has been slowly increasing at an ever faster rate. America for a time was the freest and most prosperous country on earth. We are scoring that many men and women fought and died for. The spirits of those who fought for freedom are in a state of unrest and cannot be arrested as long as people allow tyranny to continue. People don't even get angry about the ways we're being completely controlled and engineered. They let themselves be influenced by those who don't care about freedom because of what they want from them, their employers, spouses, family members, who are fake forms of loyalty. If you don't care about truth, freedom, or true love, the worst state to be is when you know what's going on and you let others keep you in fear and inaction. People in this state shut down, beat themselves up, and often go on addiction to escape the world, such as drugs, alcohol, porn, mindless browsing, video games, watching movies, etc. If you develop true courage, the universe and truth will aid you, and your life will improve. People wonder why life is so difficult, encountering so many obstacles. It is because you don't care about truth and have no courage. People just love their comfortable slavery. They have it too good to actually do something against the system of evil because they believe it benefits them, even though it does the opposite, if they knew the system how evil it was. If you love the current state of humanity, you're ignorant or screwed up morally. People don't want to speak out because they might lose what they have. The truth is you have nothing, and life and property are ultimately just temporary. And when you die, it would all be taken away from you. You never truly own anything anyways. If you must pay taxes on the fruit of your labor, your property, you do not own it. If those are regulated by the government, you do not truly own it. The idea of being in a comfortable job, relationship, house are all an illusion of comfort. You are just attached, that is all. You just want to be with someone else. You just want to have a reliable job that gives you the amount of time or amount of money you need for your lifestyle. They give a large portion of their time and energy for a paycheck, which could be better use elsewhere in their life. They will say, I'm too afraid to stand up to my boss or quit my job. Do we love comfort more than truth and freedom? That is a false form of love. This is not true love. The Greeks called it agape. This is the love of all. There is a war on self-defense, the sacred masculine testosterone. They want people to be sedated and not rebel, so it would be easier to lead them to slaughter or the chains of slavery. The globalists and social engineers want to destroy testosterone in order to remove the spirit of rebellion, not only in men, but also women. Women also need testosterone to be healthy, though not as much as men. There are many estrogen mimicking compounds such as plastic, GMO soy, and alcohol. By changing the hormonal makeup in a person or animal, you can literally turn them into the other gender, which causes all sorts of chemical imbalances, destroying health and mostly the will to rebel. This is one of the purposes of the transgender movement. Of course, as human beings, you have the right to do whatever you wish, as long as you don't hurt them. But largely, the transgender movement is propagated by social engineers who do not care about you. Courage is something that must be built inside. It takes time, especially those who are cowards. Men are often raised with no strong paternal or fatherly figure in life. In many cases, a single mother who cares only about creature comforts. If I'm going to be honest, my father was kind of active in my life for the first 8 or so years of my life, which are the most important years when most severe development happens. Then he stopped doing much with me. It was mostly my fault, I admit, but I think he could have done a better job, though I believe for the most part he did his best. I think some people online, such as Mark Passio and David Icke, helped refine my masculine and feminine qualities. Maybe that's why I decided to get active at the young age of 21, though I should have probably and could have started earlier. Being active is a masculine quality that must be developed, and women are just naturally more passive than men. My mom is an older exception. She is quite masculine, but not in a bad or unbalanced way. She is still quite feminine. Me and her are a great example of balance of masculine and feminine qualities. I am more balanced for the masculine, but we need both. That's why everyone needs a good father and mother figure. Biological mothers and fathers are best at this naturally, since they are genetically related to their children and can understand them better. However, many parents have practically abandoned or neglected their children, so it may be necessary to find positive father and mother figures in others. Just make sure you don't use the state or religion to supplement a father or mother figure. People are often balanced in both the masculine and feminine ways. There are eggheads who are also cowards. There are those who are willing to obey tyranny. Most men don't care about anything but money. Women too, who wish to find a man who can get them more money, and they also spend more money as well. This is part of the cultural Marxist plan, as well as of corporate fascism. If the founding fathers were still alive, they would call the mission up and would rebel against this nightmare. You have to be a spiritually broken person to think you could not kill another person who is coming for your life. In The Walking Dead, Rick, the hero, does not represent a moral person. When he spared the murderous psycho Negan's life, he was actually acting immorally by endangering everyone else's life by keeping Negan alive. Sparing Negan was like letting a wild, hungry tiger into a village full of children, and there is nothing moral about that. This next section is militia and guerrilla warfare. Examples include the Viet Cong, Mujahideen, Revolutionary War, the Scotch War of Independence, and the Peninsular War, although there's many examples of this. The concept of guerrilla warfare goes back to Sun Tzu, a Chinese military strategist over 2,000 years ago. He believed that all warfare involves using your strengths to exploit the enemy weaknesses. The Vietnamese NLF, the National Liberation Front, and the Viet Cong worked in small cells between 3 to 10 soldiers. Guerrilla warfare involves small squads and not large battalions of hundreds in most conventional militaries. These cells worked together but had little knowledge of each other, only what was necessary to know. Therefore, when the guerrilla was captured, he couldn't give out vital information about the NLF. The NLF had a strict code of behavior to turn them into a force which helped their communities and would not be like an invader, which often pillages, rapes women, and loots. This is to gain popular support. They were told the following: do not damage lands, crops, or spoil houses that are belonging to people. Do not buy or borrow what people are not willing to sell or lend. Be honest. Do not do or speak in a way that will make people believe we are holding them in contempt. To help them in their daily work, harvesting, fetching firewood, carrying water, sewing, etc. Most peasants were extremely poor. The 2% owned half of the land in Vietnam, which they maintained by the brute force of feudalism. The NLF educated the peasants of this fact and liberated villages from their feudal masters, often using force. The NLF was told not to go into combat unless they outnumbered the enemy and was certainty of winning. They concentrated attacks on small patrols and poorly guarded military constructs. They often attacked at night. 90% of what the NLF had was American and South Vietnamese weapons. The NLF had underground bases between villages with everything from print presses, hospitals, weapons factories, and kitchens. The large American soldiers often couldn't fit in the small Vietnamese tunnels. These tunnels were great for hiding operation, protecting them against bombing. They would also mine tunnels underneath American bases and surprise attack them. They would also use this to hide cooking, since fire wasn't reaching the sky, to signal their location, and they would use it to funnel troops and supply and for scouting. The goal of real warfare is to wear the enemy down in a long, drawn-out war. They started by taking control of small villages and expanding to larger villages and the city. At that point, the war was a more conventional, once the NLT had gained a combat advantage of the American and South Vietnamese forces. The NLF would use traps such as bouncing betties, a mine that's hidden, traps where they would create a hole and put spikes at the bottom with feces to infect soldiers who fell in the hole, so they would be covered by grass or foliage to camouflage them. Another trap is creating grenades that were activated by vines. They were often hidden, and when you were caught in one, it would stick to you because the vine was sticky, and it would also pull the pin, which means you were likely dead. One North Vietnamese colonel was asked, "Who's winning the war?" They said, "You are," to the Americans. And they said, "Who will win the war?" And he said, "We are." He asked, "Why so?" And he said, "Because you're going home." One of the main reasons Americans lost the Vietnam War is because moral support of the war on the ground and at home, and from soldiers being away from their families, fighting a long losing war. The object of many traps and operations in guerrilla warfare is not always to kill, but to win. It would also hurt the morale more in some cases, and it would also instill fear into the American forces. If a soldier was injured, it required force, so he would take care of him, and a helicopter bring them back to base. Whereas if they're dead, it would not take so much work. In the NLF forces, they would have a military and political commander, and they were on the same rank. They would have pep rallies to remind them of their Vietnamese traditions and the purpose of the war. Americans did not have the same enthusiasm. American guerrilla warfare troops were called Minutemen in the Revolutionary War. There were citizens who would at minute's notice be ready to fight. This is the purpose of militia versus a standing traditional army. The citizen becomes a soldier for the time necessary, then goes back to civilian life. In other words, they are not spending all or most of their time training, which if the military does this, they become too powerful and they cannot train endlessly and fund their operations without extorting the population or conquering other populations. The French under the occupation by Nazi Germany also used guerrilla warfare. An famous example is that they would sabotage railroads and communication stations to disrupt the Germans so that American forces could invade Normandy successfully. Once a military or the police has superior tactics, technology, and weapons, you are enslaved and at the whim of your master. The militia is necessary to ensure that the people possess the required defensive capacity to resist government tyranny. In other words, don't bring a knife to a gunfight. If a threat requiring military-grade force should arise, it will be the responsibility of the people to bring together the members and weapons of the militia to fight that force. Afterwards, the weapons should be returned to a safe place. Such weapons should not be kept in the hands of the military. Even the Constitution rewards the continuance of an army for more than 2 years, or the funding of the army. The idea that people should never wage war against tyranny is a belief that the military is too advanced to fight, because we and our ancestors allowed the military to become extremely powerful. Government-controlled militaries have no right to exist or manufacture weapons. That the people have a right to mass and bear arms. That a well-regulated militia composed of the body of people trained to arms is the proper, natural, and safe defense of a free state. That standing armies in times of peace are dangerous to liberty, and therefore ought to be avoided. George Mason. In typical military engagements, armed forces wish to secure full spectrum dominance, which is control of land, sea, and air. The primary purpose of this engagement style is to secure a supply line for your own forces while also preventing movements of supplies of the opposing force, which would allow them to continue to fight. One of the main purposes of the militia is to counteract this form of engagement. This is by having supply and the means of battle already in place, called distributed fighting force. So if supply lines are blocked by the enemy, supplies needed for the engagement are already there. Governments do not want people forming militias because it is effective in the long term against standing armies, which use full spectrum dominance. Governments wish to incrementally disarm people to prevent righteous rebellion from a people's militia against tyranny. Let's say a concentrated military force would invade the United States, or a military dictator were to rise. Then militias would exist everywhere and surround them with swarming tactic, many small and weaker forces attacking a greater force with less numbers. What, sir, is the use of militia? It is to prevent the establishment of a standing army, the bane of liberty. Whenever governments mean to invade the rights and liberties of people, they always attempt to destroy the militia in order to raise an army upon the ruins. Elbridge Gerry, Vice President of the United States. Guerrilla fighters typically do not inhabit large, well-established bases, making it impossible for the enemy to exploit technological advantages such as aerial bombardment to destroy personnel and infrastructure, since the enemy will be close by. If the guerrillas are in an urban area, their opponents cannot use powerful conventional weapons unless they are willing to inflict large number of civilian casualties and risk increasing popular support for the militia. Small guerrilla or insurgent groups also tend to be less hierarchical, meaning that a force cannot be neutralized by the capture or death of a handful of leaders. Guerrilla warriors often do not follow the laws of international warfare such as the Geneva Conventions. They will use any means necessary for victory, such as faking surrender or using medical vehicles to stage an ambush. Another example of guerrilla warfare tactics was in Concord during the Revolutionary War. There was a technique of using buildings along the route as additional cover for snipers, which provided the logical response from the British force, destruction of the buildings. When revolutionary forces forced their way into Norfolk, Virginia, and used waterfront buildings as cover for shots as British vessels shot out from the river with their cannons. The responsive destruction of those buildings was ingenious use into the advantage of rails, which encouraged the spread of fire to the largely loyalist town, and spread propaganda blaming on the British and increased support of the American revolutionaries among the loyalists. They used hit-and-run tactics, often attacking at night or in concealed terrain such as hills, jungles, and swamps. They consist mostly of fast-moving infantry using running or using cheap vehicles to stop to attack, and when the fight becomes disadvantageous, they retreat. They fight in close range and have no permanent bases, if any bases at all. Their bases are often literally underground or hidden. They also tend to have bases in urban areas hidden under the disguise of civilian bustle. They will dress in plain clothes for disguise and to confuse the enemy. They will often wear clothes that blend in with the terrain or with the civilian population. They often start with crude weapons, but as they salvage weapons from the enemies, they gain more advanced weaponry. They attempt to destroy the logistics of the enemy, such as railroads, which can stop the supply of goods. They may employ traps to repel invaders. They kill military captains in order to weaken the morale of the troops in order for the common soldier to want to leave due to lack of leadership. They torture and show off torture, such as in Wallachia and Vlad the Impaler, who impaled invading Ottoman troops in order to scare them, to strike fear into the enemies, to make them scared to fight. They make decoy soldiers and bases to waste ammo and bombs and to give a sense of large numbers. Guerrillas should fight short and close-range battles. This helps them because it prevents them from being under attack by artillery and bombs. The goal is not to inflict massive casualties, but to drain the enemy of resources. Guerrilla warriors are often use children to conduct their operation as well as the old. They have no strict age requirements. They often engage in total war where the whole local population supports the war effort. After all, they are fighting for their lives. There's also some great advantages. The guerrilla fights for freedom rather than money, which gives them a moral advantage since if they lose everything they know and care for. They're on the defense, which gives them an advantage. They know the terrain better, making fighting combat that is typically unsuitable for battles such as swamps and jungles advantageous for them. They know the people of their country better, so they're able to recruit them from the local population more effectively and receive assistance and supplies from the community faster, making logistics much harder to destroy because of the short travel distance. This makes it easier for them to gather intel from the enemy since every citizen that supports their cause, which will be many, can spell on that enemy. They're less susceptible to counterintelligence and propaganda of the enemy, as they can easily see through the manipulation. In colonial America, shooting rampages almost never happened because a large population of free-bodied people comprised the militia and it was armed with the latest firearms suitable for military service. Those arms actually include almost any type of arms that you could imagine. And they were also to repel invasions. What sort of arms might an invader have? Well, they wouldn't be coming with muskets, would they? They would be coming with the most modern military infantry army with tanks, jets, battleships, artillery, and drones. A militia is supposed to be decentralized and not reliant on one or few leaders, since that leader may die. All militia members are trained to be leaders. They are also supposed to fill multiple combat roles and are less rigid than in traditional warfare. Every soldier should be able to be a scout, a medic, sniper, etc. If a leader is lost, they can be replaced with another, and they can train the group and command them. A true militia system is based on voluntary system of enlistment. In other words, there is no draft or conscription. Conscription is slavery. People are more likely to enlist if they do so by choice than by force. A good example is that the Confederacy increased their military to 15 times its original size in a few months, which was initially based on a voluntary enlistment, while the conscription-based military during World War I grew by only 3 times its original size. They are bound by their comrades and their purpose for fighting. Men fight more when it's not for the defense of their homeland than by abstract causes created by politicians such as oil. There is no need for a national army. When people are fighting to protect the lives of one community and property, there is no need to offer any other incentive such as money to fight. Defense is the natural reaction. Voluntary, non-government controlled, decentralized militias are incredibly effective at defeating invaders, and only an invader needs more reasons. So to perform the function of repelling invasions, the members of the militia should have something like an AR-15 or maybe an M16 rifle. To suppress insurrection is another one of the 3 purposes for the militia. An insurrection might be a local riot, in which case would be sufficient to have the type of firearms and equipment that the police have, and sometimes even fully automatic weapons. All of those would be necessary to perform the militia functions, and who would have particular types of arms would depend on what kind of duty to perform in the militia. It's not just the right, it's also duty you need to fill, just like you have a duty to serve on a jury for a call. If you leave that so-called professionals, you'll wind up with a class over you, who eventually will see themselves separate and above you, superior to you, and you as a second-class citizen. If you're in a militia, people responsible for your own security, that's much less likely to happen. So it's incredibly important for everyone to accept that duty and step up. If an insurgency is an ill-founding uprising, either political or criminal, a government can treat it as such and call on the support of other governments if necessary. But if an insurgency is founded on legitimate grievances that a completely corrupt government refuses to accept, much less amend, then the conflict will not be ended until that government agrees to reach a solution by negotiation, not force. Too many governments influenced by strong military establishments or sweeping declarations of war have refused to recognize the legitimacy of guerrilla action seeking, instead a short victory by means of military force, which is easily answered by guerrilla warfare. The next section is self-defense training and safety. Guns keep people on equal footing regardless of age, size, physical capacity. It makes it easier for muggers through not allowing good people to defend themselves. Guns favor weak attackers, not a strong attacker, unlike a armed or melee weapon. It prevents people from using force since the attacker now is at a disadvantage, or at least they could be killed very quickly, and it will make them change their mind to be more peaceful. Guns. It's better not to have one and not need it than to need one and not have it. Why would you need a combat rifle, a semi-auto or fully auto rifle? It depends. It is to defend yourself against government, which is always based on coercion and violence, and can and will become tyrannical. Good people won't allow this to happen without a fight. They know that government has no right to take away or attempt to take rights and freedoms. Combat rifles are ultimately needed for shooting and killing multiple agents of the state should that become necessary. Good people should be armed. Many people understandably associate firearms with violence and bloodshed. And because decent people don't want violence and bloodshed, many instinctively dislike or fear firearms and support so-called gun control based on the assumption that outlawing firearms would mean reducing violence and bloodshed. In reality, this is not the case. Saying I don't want a firearm because I don't want violence concept of budget is no more rational than saying I don't want an airbag because I don't want to crash. Of course, the reason people want airbags is not because they're eager to crash, because they understand that in the unfortunate that they do get in a serious accident, having an airbag is very likely to reduce human pain and suffering. And so it is a firearm in the fortunate event that violence does occur. Good people being armed can dramatically reduce or lessen human pain and suffering, especially the pain and suffering of innocent people. Everyone knows that you shouldn't use something like a chainsaw if you don't know how to use it properly. Or if you think you might hurt yourself or someone else, it's the same with firearms. If you don't feel comfortable with them, or you think you might hurt yourself or someone else, either don't have one or learn to use them properly. But make no mistake, if you do not possess the means and willingness to forcefully defend yourself and your family, that won't magically stop the nasty people out there from having the means and willingness to victimize you. Ask yourself this simple question. If someday you would happen to be where an armed thug or deranged killer strikes, would the people will be better off with you unarmed or with you not armed? Unfortunately, the bad guys of the world aren't nice enough to advance warnings of where or when they intend attacks. If such an event does occur, you are going to wait around for you to go and buy a gun so you can come back and stop them. You'll either be prepared ahead of time or you won't be prepared. Do you ever put your seatbelt on only when you're about to have an accident, or is it better to wear it all the time, even if you don't actually need it the vast majority of the time? Now, some politicians and pundits accuse those who support an individual's right to keep and bear arms of wanting violence to occur. You have to wonder about the same politicians and pundits who accuse people who wear seat belts of wanting to crash. If there was some way to wave a magic wand and disarm all the bad guys in the world, that would be nice. But in the real world, the best chance the innocents have for staying nice and alive is for good people to possess the means to resist violent attackers with defense force of their own. The evidence shows that responsible people being armed reduces crime. Now think about this. We've seen thousands of examples of bad guys in movies using guns, but have you ever seen a Hollywood movie or TV show that depicts the average armed citizen committing a crime? Real life happens all the time. So why does Hollywood almost never show it happening? Well, that's a result of ignorance and some political agenda. Movie makers constantly misrepresent gun owners, and it not only seems clueless about firearms and how they work, but they seem completely ignorant of even the most basic rules of firearm ownership rules, which millions of Americans know by heart. I go over these gun rules, safety rules later. Even the supposedly good guys in movies violate these rules constantly, so it's any wonder that most Americans are scared of firearms. In 1966 through 67, the media highly publicized a safety course which taught Orlando women how to use guns. The result, Orlando's rate dropped 88% in 1967, whereas the rate remained the rest of Florida and in the nation. Human beings only have two ways to deal with another: reason and force. If you want me to do something, you have a choice of either convincing me via argument or force me to do your bidding under threat of force. Every human interaction falls into one of these categories without exception. Reason or force, that's it. In a truly moral and civilized world, people exclusively interact through persuasion. Force has no place as a valid method of social interaction, and the only thing that removes force from the menu is the personal firearm, as paradoxical as it might sound. When you carry a gun, you cannot deal with me by force. You have to use reason to try to persuade me, because I have a way to negate your threat or employment of force. The gun is the only personal weapon that puts a 100-pound woman on equal with footing of a 220-pound mugger, a 75-year-old retiree on equal footing with a 19-year-old gangbanger, and a single guy on equal footing with a carload of guys with baseball bats. The gun removes the disparity in physical strength, size, or numbers between a physical attacker and defender. There are plenty of people who consider a gun as a source of bad force equations. These are the people who think that we'd be more civilized all guns were removed from society because a firearm makes it easier for an armed muggler to do his job. That, of course, is only true if the muggler's potential victims are also disarmed either by choice or by legislative fiat. It has no validity when most of the mugger's potential marks are armed. People who argue for the banning of arms ask for automatic rule by the young, the strong, and the many, and that's the exact opposite of the civilized society. A mugger, even an armed one, can only make a successful living in a society where the state has granted him the force monopoly. Then there's the argument that the gun makes confrontations lethal that always would result in injury. The argument is fallacious in several ways. Without guns involved, confrontations are won by the physically superior party inflicting overwhelming injury on the loser. People who think that fists, bats, sticks, or stones don't constitute lethal force watch too much TV. People take beatings and come out with a bloody lip at worst. The fact that the gun makes lethal force easier works solely in the favor of the weak defender, not the strong attacker. If both are armed, the field is level. The gun is the only weapon that's as lethal in the hands of an elderly person as in the hands of a weightlifter. It simply wouldn't work as well as a force equalizer if it wasn't both lethal and easily employable. When I carry a gun, I don't do so because I'm looking for a fight, because I'm looking to be left alone. The gun at my side means that I cannot be forced, only persuaded. I don't care because I'm afraid, because it enables me to be unafraid. It doesn't limit the action of those who interact with me through reason, only those who would do so by force. It removes force from the equation. That's why carrying a gun is a civilized act. That was The Gun is Civilization by Major Lieutenant Caudill, United States Marine Corps, retired. In order to survive a mass shooting, whether you're out in public, you must pay attention to your surroundings. Look for exits and covers around you. Notice who is armed around you, or if someone has a suspicious bulge in the shape of a gun. By identifying a potential threat, you can sometimes prevent an attack or protect you and your loved ones better. Use your gut feelings to determine if you think something wrong. You're probably right. Look for strange occurrences in the environment, odd behavior. There are 3 courses of actions. Escape. Get as far away from the threat as possible. This should be easy if you were observant prior to the event. Take cover. If you can't escape, find cover and wait for the opportunity to escape or fight back. Make sure the cover is strong like a brick wall, not say like plywood. If you are armed and trained, use the ability to remove the threat. Know that sometimes you can't get a clear shot without putting others at risk. Know the power of your firearm and ammo. Will your bullets go through the perpetrator? Know what gunfire sounds like. That way, if you can't see your target, if you can't see the gunfire, you can take action instead of staying there being confused and vulnerable. One of the common desires for mass shooters is to inflict as much damage as possible, so move away from the group as much as possible. Don't get down or play dead, and action is better than inaction. Listen for the reload. After a certain amount of bullets have been fired, the gun must reload. The mass shooter is vulnerable during reloading. However, you only have a few seconds if it is an experienced gunman. Are you going to wait for someone to save you, or going to go and save yourself? There comes a point in situations where survival is unlikely. Don't go down without a fight at least. Protection of person is the job of bodyguards. Unless you're rich enough to afford them, you may wish to learn how to be your own bodyguard. Considering that most people have learned to be their own chauffeurs, chefs, and accountants, learning yet another skill won't be much different. Some good martial arts include Krav Maga, Jiu-Jitsu, and Muay Thai. Try to focus on martial arts that are practical self-defense, not focusing so much on the art aspect. An example of a martial art that is more focused on the art than the martial part is Tai Chi, but it's more similar to yoga than it is about fighting. The advantage of having a large magazine is that if you miss, which you likely will, you will still be able to hit your targets, and you will still have enough ammo in the gun before you must reload. Reloading requires multiple hands in a few seconds, maybe even minutes for an inexperienced person. It also may take multiple bullets to stop an attacker, or if there is multiple attackers. When trained to use a gun with simple ammo and no attachments, try to understand how your gun operates in the basics before you get to the more advanced training. Whenever you have decent experience with your weapon, you want to incorporate stress training. Stress training is important if you're going to carry a weapon on you or for home defense. Failing to do so once you have good training on the firearm is a waste of ammo, gas, club memberships, etc. You must incorporate stress training at some point in order to be proficient. You must be able to shoot, reload, and know how ammunition, rounds, bullets, they're often called, you have in your magazine. Be able to clear jams as well. Stress can cause you to act not normal to the point where you may not act as you would in a stress-free environment of shooting at the range. You may panic, distress, or even worse, freeze. Just because you aren't looking for trouble doesn't mean trouble won't find you. In order to simulate this, you should time yourself in order to reduce the stress of time. Compete in competitions, exercise intensely in short bursts, and then do target shooting, or participate in airsoft and paintballing. You cannot completely rely on others for your self-defense unless you can afford bodyguards constantly, which is why you should be your own bodyguard. This is equivalent to the idea you don't need to brush your teeth, but you have a dentist. The police will always be too late, even if they even answer at all. The average response time for police is 5 minutes, and in 5 seconds or less you can be killed. Rifles are great for home defense because they have large magazines and can penetrate body armor more effectively than most pistols. They're also more accurate and do more damage. Using force is not the same as attacking with violence. Some of the same people have no problem calling police if they are under attack, which is logical and caring. To let yourself and others you care about be accosted or to defend them. Surrendering to evil and criminals does not guarantee safety. In fact, the opposite, it only encourages them to continue. It's like throwing bloody meat into a shark-infested water and conditioning the sharks to expect easy pickings at your expense. 1 out of 100 people are willing to do harm to you if they wanted to, according to Jeff Cooper. Being alert is the first and possibly the most important principle you must know of self-defense. This doesn't mean you have to be paranoid. Just take a notice of what's going on around you. Be aware if something seems suspicious and makes you feel uncomfortable as well. That could be your intuition telling you that something bad is about to happen. Evaluate the situation and decide swiftly and decisively what to do. Another is that if you're with a group of people, you must all work together to overpower the attacker if you're going to fight. The bystander effect is powerful, and someone expects someone else to initiate the fight. You must be the one to do it. Do not rely on others. Certain situations have happened where an attacker could have been repelled had the group worked together to fight. But instead of choosing to fight, they did nothing and became victims. When an attacker is overwhelmed, they are likely to retreat and not to continue attacking. This is a primal survival instinct. Speed is important. Self-defense situations are extremely fast. Usually they happen within a matter of seconds. You need good instincts and you want to be quick in order to prevent your attacker from being able to effectively react to you. Speed is also a good intimidation tactic. It could freak out your opponent and startle them. If you punch someone in the face 20 times in 5 seconds, that will likely make them think twice. This is similar to the concept of a small cat scratching you and your natural instinct is to back off even though it not do significant damage and despite a human being being 20 times stronger. You'll want to maintain your cool during these situations. You can train all you want at the range shooting and have 100% accuracy, but if you cannot maintain your cool, you'll miss every shot during these stressful situations. Ruthlessness is also necessary for safety. If somebody attacks you, do not worry about their safety. They are morally wrong for initiating the attack. Repel them with the same force they used against you, or threaten greater force in order to stop them. If a threat does not work, fire warning shots. Remember, the best thing to do is simply escape the situation. Attack the attacker in the weak spots. Poke their eyes, groin, and punch them in the neck, whatever is necessary. Everything has the potential to be a weapon. A fist, hammer, bat, car, broken glass, bottle, knives, etc. Yelling help can also be effective, since someone may come and help you, or the opponent may think someone is coming to help you. They will want to quiet you and will be aiming for your mouth, while you can use this as a distraction and hit them on vulnerable areas such as the groin. Being successful is more important than being famous. Being famous makes you a target. Do not show off your money or wear expensive clothes and jewelry which thieves might want to steal. Avoid bars, loud places, and places where people might be doing drugs and alcohol. People are more likely to be violent at these places. Try to avoid going out at night, especially after 10 p.m. Nothing good happens at after 10 p.m. in public generally. Guns should be treated as if they were always loaded. Check to see if it is loaded. Pick it up carefully and check. Even after checking, assume it's still loaded. Do not let the muzzle, which is often referred to as the barrel, cover anything you are not willing to destroy. Imagine the muzzle as an infinite range lightsaber that will cut anything you point towards. Keep your finger off the trigger until your target is in sight and are sure of what your target is. Also be aware is what behind the target and the ammo you are using. Certain ammo penetrates more than others, which you need to be aware of that. Be aware of the ricochet possibility, which is when the bullet bounces off and continues to travel. Always have a firm grip on the firearm to prevent dropping it or firing it at targets you do not wish to hit. If you're holding your gun, it's best to hold it with the muzzle pointing towards the ground. Make sure you are practice shooting to be far enough away from your target, especially if you're shooting something like glass, which could hit you if you are too close. Handguns are ideal for self-defense. They are light, small, which makes them easy to carry around and to be used effectively with the threat of quick force and lethal force from a distance. Unlike many other self-defense tools like peppers, sprays, and knives, they can also be used one-handed. The use of a handgun doesn't always involve firing it. Most criminals will stop when done with lethal force. If that doesn't work, firing will. Dogs depend on non-resistance for success. When effective and Swiss resistant is offers, the attack usually stops. Guns aren't equalized, meaning that a young, strong dog can fare just as well as an old, frail grandma. Rendering yourself defenseless or supporting gun control will only leave you a victim of criminals. In addition, being a society that supports gun rights increases your safety, even if you do not carry, because that means criminals think you might be carrying, or others nearby who could defend you. Taking precautions does not mean the event is more likely to happen. It is to prevent yourself from being a victim of an attacker or of circumstances. A firearm, besides a car, is the greatest force multiplier. It has a great potential for lethal force than even the most skilled martial artists, plus having the advantage of being able to threaten lethal force against attack and having greater range. This is why some guns are called peacemakers. A number of people think that those who break into a home are only looking for stuff, but that may not always be the case. They may be trying to kidnap, rape, or kill you. Reasoning and complying with them is usually a poor choice if you have the option to resist them. Putting a gun at someone is not nice, but neither is breaking into someone's home. Remember, this is not an accidental act. Most burglars are trying to look for things that are valuable, that are light, and they can grab quickly and leave before they're spotted. If you're not armed, the criminal will likely attack you in order to prevent you from calling for help. The only real organism that has a threat to humanity are human beings themselves. This is because we have the tools we're able to defend ourselves with to protect against predators. We're also a social species willing to protect our own and often very large communities. Some say that you are the evil you fight, but this is not always the case. Do not become the evil you fight if you're fighting the evil with a strong backbone of principles. As I said before, self-defense is not the same as aggression. We do not necessarily need barbed wire fences, mines, sandbag windows to be safe. Living righteous and peaceful lives will greatly improve our safety. Just as good health isn't solely dependent on food or exercise, the same is true for being armed. Each is an essential component of the whole. Guns are not evil and only used for criminal purposes. Knives and machetes are seen as mere tools, not able to conduct harm on their own. The same is true for guns. They are only tools used for self-defense. Put your ego away when fighting. Focus on yourself. Do not be an aggressive person in conversation and throw insults. This might provoke people into attacking you. Speak your mind, of course, and don't let anyone boss you around, but careless insults and taunting will not help you in any way. If someone is trying to attack you for what you said, simply apologize, put your hands toward them in an apologetic way. Also, having your hands up is better than in your pocket, so you'll be ready to defend yourself unless you have a weapon in your pocket. Sometimes the best thing to do with an attacker is to do what they say so you can live another day. An example is that if you're being robbed, say things such as, "Don't hurt me, I'll give you a chance for I'll give you whatever you want." Do not say, "Dude, WTF are you doing? Back up." This will trigger the criminal to hurt or kill you. By being submissive, you can trick your assailant to bringing their guard down since they think you are being submissive and will not fight. At that moment, you should strike them out of surprise. This was episode 7, Self-Defense Principle. Contact me for questions, comments, and if you want to be a guest and what you're struggling with. Have a good day.